So what I was saying is that my friend who was smooth around cops because his father had actually been a cop in Africa, so he knew how his father operated and how his father dealt with people. His father was very smooth at managing people. A lot of times you would think that you imagine what's like a high tier officer, like in the truest sense of an officer. It's not necessarily like commando style, like crazy stuff. Like my friend's father, who was a police officer, he could drive really well. I remember sometimes he would give me a ride home and he wouldn't be speeding, but he was an excellent driver, being a police officer. And he also had a friend from South Africa who was here. I'm not sure if he was also a cop, but he was also an outstanding, excellent driver. That friend of his went back to Africa around the time that I was in high school, and he had a job like chauffeuring exotic cars between Namibia and South Africa on these highways in Africa. And they would drive fast as hell, those people that were with him. And they would have, just like we have deer that come out in front of us, they have something called kudu that come out in Africa. The kudu might actually be a little bit more agile and different temperament than deer that are actually more dangerous on the highways. But a lot of people get hurt, maimed, and killed in that Southwest South Africa area because of kudu coming on the highway, and that was him. But my friend's father was outstanding as a driver, and he was very strong. If my friend had stronger vision, he was interested in things like martial art, any sport that my friend would have been interested in. If he had strong vision, he would have been formidable. It's actually something of a grace to a lot of people that he didn't have stronger vision, because he was already something to deal with in a problem physically and intellectually. With the visual deprivation, I think the visual deprivation actually brought out some of his mental gifts, such as like humor, actually reading people, and music. He actually, me and him put each other onto a lot of music. He put me onto Tribe Called Quest, and I had grown up in New Mexico, and I loved all kinds of hip hop. I grew up on like Eazy-E, Bone Thugs and Harmony, Dr. Dre, all that stuff my mom wasn't trying to let me have with my best friends. I could either get it at their house or they would burn it for me. But I also appreciated alternative music. When I was in the Southwest, because my friend's father was Native American, and they would take us like outdoors to like water holes in New Mexico that go deep under the earth, mountain springs, and mountain biking. And we would go way out in New Mexico. We would do something cool in nature, and then like this crazy, New Mexico has these crazy storms that'll come out of nowhere, and it's very flat, so you can see them coming on, but they'll come on fast. So you'll have a dust storm out of nowhere, you'll have a flash flood out of nowhere, a lightning storm, and we would have these cool ass, crazy ass storms where we had just worked up an appetite. Like, one of the best experiences of food, like a lot of times we actually get jaded by food, where food becomes a little bit bland because we're overfed and oversatiated, so we're jaded to some of the brilliance of food. But if you work up an appetite, natural food is the best balance. There's almost nothing more outstanding than coconut water. Just the right amount and the right lack of sweetness is coconut water. Just the right sustenance, that's real soul food. But also like an apple, a green apple, a red apple, or a pear, or a peach. It doesn't even got to be a ripe peach, even a little bit like kind of unripe peach or a plum. That I do a lot of food delivery myself. I deliver for all kinds of outstanding restaurants. But that, what I just mentioned right there, would sound the best to me with an appetite. Sometimes we go swimming at this swimming pool, the Johnson Swimming Pool Center in New Mexico, and we have brilliant experiences. And my mom would have like this big old like kind of wicker purse, and she would whip out some green apples after we just worked up an appetite swimming. Almost nothing in this life gives you an appetite like swimming. That is an appreciation for tasting food like swimming. That apple is life itself like that. But my friend's dad would do that same thing, where we'd go out somewhere in nature and we get smoked. Time flies when you're having fun. Tiredness also passes when you're having fun, where you don't know how tired you just got doing something cool as hell. But then we come back smoked from doing something. These lightning storms would come over, and then he'd be playing some badass alternative music from the 90s while we were in the 90s. Listen to Green Day like that. Listen to Foo Fighters like that. Listen to Nirvana like that. In New Mexico, the land of enchantment, with those kind of R&B vibes. And then I had another friend whose mom, we lost her early. He was a very good friend of mine, and she thought that I looked like some of these light skinned. There's, I think, the Hootie and the Blowfish. I reminded her of Hootie and the Blowfish, and she's like, "Oh, you're about those alternative." I said something to her. I gave myself away as appreciating alternative. She said, "Oh, you like alternative? You remind me of Hootie and the Blowfish." So I was up on alternative. I loved hip hop and I loved alternative. And then I got up here. A lot of people weren't rocking with alternative or like skater vibes, like where I was at in the north. But I put my friend up on alternative, and to this day, I bet you he would thank me for that. And he still rocks. So I put him up to opening his mind around music. And then later when we became grown, he put me up to opening my mind to more music. So he always put me on a lot of music, but then he put me on even more when we became grown. So he put me up on like Daft Punk, like the music sounds better with you, stuff like that. And so just like really cool vibes around music. But he also, they say, according to Osho, a blind person can actually keep a secret better than someone with strong, because blind people, they see something of life. They actually can see more of life for seeing less of life. In a way, it can be appreciated. For one is that, according to Osho, when you're blind, you don't see blackness. Some people think you see pitch black when you're blind. You don't see pitch black even. You have no concept of light or dark because you have no sensation of visual perception. That range of experience is beyond you. That is still maybe within you, but it's beyond you, that you can't respond to that. Yet it opens up other dimensions, because where one door closes, another would open. It's appreciated. So my friend was he had a deeper than deep appreciation for music, where it was almost like it was like beyond a fetish and a passion. It was actually beyond that. Deep connection to music. But then also some of that rubbed off on me, because me and him were very, very close for a lot of life. And I would say that because you can't see your own face and you can only see another person, I would say that a lot of who he is in life is more of who I am than I actually am, because I simply experienced more of him than I have of myself. That is, I have never looked at myself other than a smartphone or a mirror, but I've seen enough of his ass breaking my balls in my face. That is like beating me down with humor, stuff like that. But you know, to each his own, and that made me a lot stronger. So as an adult, when people get out of pocket or confrontational, it just reminds me of growing up a lot. So it's not. Sometimes I can be. I'm not trying to say I'm all about the smoke. Hell no. I'm all. I don't like smoking anything, but or getting smoked. But except if it's fitness, sometimes it is cool to get smoked in fitness. But I'm more so familiar with conflict and strife and people having words, because some of my friends were like, they were intense people. My father was too. My father was an intense person. My father was like really all or nothing. He didn't abuse us or be flagrant, and neither did my friend. But they were all happy or they're all mad as the situation went, and they'd make up. They'd go back the other way really fast. But my friend had a deeper facility with people. He could see where a person was at mentally and engage a person mentally differently because of the lack of visual perception. So I think I was exposed to some of his social skills. I was daunted by some of his social skills because it is actually a hard act to follow a lot in life. And there's something of like codependence and something called transference, where when you're with a person who's very influential in life, according to Osho, an influential person is polarizing. They'll either magnetize you or they will repel you. There's really no in between with a magnetic person. But then also, if they have a degree of stature, like a couple years development on you, that can be there can be a lot of transference where a lot of them becomes you, and it can affect your formation of an identity for better and worse. At first it's for worse at that time, because you're less sure of yourself, and it can challenge your sensation of self when you're around someone with that strong of a command and sense of self, even at a young age. But then as you heal from that and you recover and you form your own life, what that made me leery of friends and associates at that experience of life, because there was nothing worse than the experience of falling into someone else's life and wherever you go, people see more of that person in you than they see you in you, or even then you see you in you, or you in them for seeing you being around a magnetic person like that. So it can be very difficult. But then as you go through that process, coming out of that 5, 10, 15, 20 years later, some of those graces rub off on you. And so that was actually you being born in life, because we're actually born through life. We're not just born when we come out the womb, we're born all through life. So those would be actually some of my growing pains, that kind of stuff. But he was very smooth around the cops, because he could I don't want to say he's smooth around the cops like he was singing to them, but he wasn't shy about challenging anyone in life if they were out of pocket, even a cop. But he wouldn't challenge a cop for the sake of being a cop, and he wouldn't challenge the cop and their authority. He would challenge them on a point. And so he could stand his ground with cops. But I just wanted to say that that's something I learned about him, and I learned those lessons on Larpenteur with him, and because we would get pulled over a lot on Larpenteur, a little bit more of the west end from where that was, but we would actually go past that point, because that point where Philando Castile was slain is actually almost on the same block as a billiards hall that's still there. That we would always go to that billiards hall. I worked as a summer camp counselor in like the summer before my senior year. I blew about a quarter or a third of my paycheck helping my friend foot his first used vehicle, and then the rest of it I spent at that pool hard billiards, because I'd lose a lot of pool to him. I'd say like that. Even though he had the visual deprivation, I'd lose a lot of pool, and whoever lost the pool paid for the table. So that's how I blew my what I stashed away that summer. But I was very familiar with that same block where Philando Castile was slain, and also that street of Larpenteur. But so what I wanted to say is that it's significant when we're introduced to people like through our family. So like you would say like prearranged marriage, but also prearranged friendship, where my family introduced me to that family. And the strangest thing is that, so I won't call anyone out, but their family, right? It's a blended family, and half of the name of their blended family is the same name as a very famous family that's famous for being hella wicked, corrupt, not wicked, corrupt, but sketchy and haunted. Is half of that family. The other half of that family is like a surname that would be like a shrewd businessman that would do what he had to do to survive, as that affected and didn't affect other people throughout generations in a small community in Africa. If you can imagine, just like a name that would go with like a very shrewd businessman, when before the time of technology, like a businessman making business moves is that family's name. So that's the kind of people I grew up around. But they were really cool, and they taught me my best lessons around socializing and also morality were from that family, because the older brother, he was even smoother with social graces and confidence, and he would that's where I wanted to go next, is that the older brother was from, okay, so if you listen to me speak like this, right, every once in a while, I think yesterday, and then maybe like at least often, people will ask me, where am I from? Because something about how I come across, it's difficult for people to lay a finger on where I might be from. But one person I've met was able to exactly decipher where I'm from. There is some form of connection between what's called the Native American Indians and India that is not promulgated in the modern in the status quo modern lexicon of knowledge as is popularly understood and available. I picked that up on the channel of Taj Tariq Bey. Also, when I was talking about Africa, I was saying that my father has recognized that the Spanish language sounds similar to what he's familiar with in Africa. Where I was going is that, so my father is from the Ovo Herero people. Ovo means people, Herero means people. That other family that I was referencing is also Herero, and my father had recognized that just by looking at the person, and that's how they met. I think that a lot of people wouldn't be able to articulate how gravity works. If you meet a scientist, how does gravity work? How does gravity work? We can't see gravity, but we can feel it and we can see the effects. How does gravity work? In space, according to Arthur Avalon, there are no absolute directions in space. That is, without a reference to another direction or a landmark of some kind, you have no bearing for direction. And I think also, even if you were to go along magnetic lines, the magnetic directions of the Earth, they shift and they're variable. I extrapolate from that that time is also not absolute and relative, because without a reference, also, you have no sensation of time. If you were inside, as I'm sitting right now in broad daylight, if I were inside a tent that had no access to sunlight and I couldn't hear anything transpiring as a reference, I wouldn't know what time of day it was or how long I had been there after a certain point. That might be how brutal would that be to be in solitary confinement with sensory deprivation. Some people would say solitary confinement, but they still have light and like resources and pastimes and like literature to engage, which is not, it's still deprivation, but it's not the same as sensory deprivation. But if you deprive a person of their references, sensory references, but also references of landmark and position, there's no actual appreciable value to what's called direction and time, I would say. So from that standpoint, I think that what exists, what's appreciated as far as the sun, they say the sun is this many million miles away. I think that's somewhat arbitrary. The sun is at a different wavelength, a different energy, is existing at a different frequency that corresponds. And because we have these two eyes like this, according to Osho, it gives us the sense of self and other and depth perception. I have an uncle who's actually blind in one eye. He actually signed himself up for a tour of duty during the Vietnam War, and he got himself all the way conscripted and trained. I think he might have been trained at one of your famous bases on the East Coast. I would want to say Fort Bragg, or I can't say that specifically. One of your famous bases that was training people for war. It's kind of crazy. Like, if you can imagine being conscripted for war, so you're standing in line for stuff, right? You're standing in line for like your different tests and batteries, and then okay, it's like a matter of course, like you're lining up for this, you're waiting for that, you're signing this, you're getting tested for this, you're running a little bit like this. It's like you're getting lined up and waiting to get on a roller coaster to go straight to hell. And it's like, oh yeah, man, what are you here for? Yeah, I'm from such and such, man. We're about to go up on this road. So yeah, I heard it goes way up there, man. It goes to this and that country, and then it's gonna send us straight to hell. And they might take some. They take pictures. They take pictures as you go up. We're gonna all take a picture, and it's gonna take your own picture and a picture of all of us going up. But then when it goes down, it actually doesn't come back. So like, and then it's like some people be like, oh yeah, man. So you're signing up, man. So you're gonna go see the world, man. Oh, that's cool, man. You're gonna go see the world, but your ass ain't gonna come back. So you got a one-way ticket to hell, you got a one-way ticket around the world that doesn't come back. But I'm just, some people say, man, that's dark humor, man. You're bogus for saying it. It's funny because like a lot of people, like I noticed, especially entitled people, they love dark shit. Like they're all about dark, like, but it's so dark. It's like, yeah, but it's kind of dark. It's kind of dark, and like they do art, like different art stuff, and it's like, yeah, and it's like it's kind of wicked, like, and we got this little shirt of like a demon, right? It's like this little badass demon, right? But then like, you said something about my mom. That's wrong, man. Man, fuck you, man. You said something about my mom. Hell no, that's wrong, man. So it's cool to be a demon over here and to fuck this one over and that one over, but then when it hits close to home, it's different like that. So I just want to say, like, but a lot of people love dark humor, right? But what the fuck? You said this and that about service. You said that the service is sending people straight to hell on a roller coaster, straight to hell. A one-way ticket, a one-way bat out of society, straight to hell, and that's funny. Is that not dark humor? But somebody could probably watch me in this video and pop a comment that'd be way darker than all this, and probably have me in my feelings too. So I gotta pipe down with that, man. But we gotta laugh at life, because what else do we got, man? So if somebody sends us to hell, or someone we love to hell, man, we could cry about it, and then they get the ups, or we could laugh about it and say, yeah, we're all about to rendezvous down there. And but yeah, so according to Osho, you would have way cooler company in hell than you would anywhere else. That would be some real company there. You'd have some of the finest company, and the most interesting conversations, and also dark humor, and redeeming, enlightening dark humor would be found in hell, likely, according to Osho. Dang, I did digress with that one. But so my people are, my father is from the Overhead Edo people that suffered a order of genocide from the young nation of Germany at that time, where Africa had been split up like a pie between like Belgium, France. The country where I come from, there was Dutch presence there. So there was Dutch presence between Namibia and South Africa prominently, if not other places. The combination of the Dutch language with some of the African influence amounted to something called Afrikaans, which is still a language that might be one of your major languages in South Africa, and also heavily in Namibia. But English is also, I think the national language in South Africa and Namibia is English. So South African native going many decades back would be familiar with English. They'd have a unique way of speaking that you could identify if you're familiar with that. And then a person from Namibia also would, but there's a very strong Afrikaans Dutch sound to it. So I grew up hearing a lot of Afrikaans because I was always with this family, my best friend, and also they were close with my family. Me and my friend were, but also our families were close independently. But I grew up around that Afrikaans, and then also my friends, they had something of that Dutch demeanor, because the language actually it affects some of how you form your identity and how you experience life within that language. And I've thought that a language is a people and a people are the language. So I actually grew up around Afrikaans in that my friend's family were always talking. Now that I think about it, they're probably talking about me in Afrikaans. They're always going into Afrikaans. They're probably like, what are you doing with this what are you wasting this kid's time for? Don't you know you're supposed to be doing your homework? Or don't you know your ass is supposed to be doing something different? What are you wasting your time and his for? That's what my friend's mom would say. She was cold like that. She'd be like, yeah, man, and you guys are always, they were about making money. My friend and his dad and his mom, they were always working like double shifts as nurses and crazy stuff, and they had the receipts to show for their hard work. But she'd be like, you guys are watching this TV, and they got paid for that. These actors, they got paid for that. But what are you doing watching this TV? You're watching the people get paid? Who taught you this, to watch people get paid like that? So they did teach us that good work ethic like that. But so the countries, they got divvied up like that. And Germany, they came later to colonialism because I think they were a later nation with respect to the other colonial countries. But then also I think they might have been a little bit newer to colonialism, almost like new money, new treachery, new colonialism, new gentrification, and it amounted to them making a genocide order against the overhead people. But when you refer to the language, it's called Ishi Herero, which means the Herero language. But my father is also Ishi Herero and Ishi Ovambo. Ovambo is my paternal grandfather is Ovambo, and my paternal grandmother is Herero. And then but Ovambo and Herero, there's also there's tribal politics in Africa. So even this family I grew up around, they were what's called colored and Herero. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but in different societies that have experienced colonialism, one thing that has attended colonialism and also helped sustain colonialism is colorism. Because a lot of people who, if you're not appreciated as completely white, ethnically, you don't get some of the favors and privilege in colonial societies. The Americas, the Caribbean, the Africas itself, South America, all the places you've experienced colonialism. If you're not appreciated as being totally white, or appreciated for being white, at least, you're not getting the full. You're not. When I was a little kid, like they'd have like the state fair would come through New Mexico, right? And they'd have a lot of rides, but some people would get this little unlimited ride pass as a kid. It would be like this little green wristband, and you leave it on your wrist for like 2 weeks, and you could ride whatever ride you want or don't want to ride. So going back historically, being appreciated as white is like a legal code caste according to Tashriq Bey, and it would refer to being entitled to and viable as being worthy of being and attaining literacy, which a lot of things like such as voting, which would amount to property, which amounts to the standing and the opportunities and advantages to sustain our existence. Voting would be barred by literacy. Probably property itself voting would probably be barred by property. Property and voting would probably be barred by literacy, both in terms of like employment and like different screens. And that might have been a lot of what your colleges functioned as in the past. Would be like, so you send the elite of the elite to these colleges, and they get people literate and also like versed in the etiquette that would have you move and be able to pass yourself off as landed and wealthy. And that's actually what these young people today, and people of all ages, are fighting each other tooth and nail for today, is to get that little stamp of being literate. So actually when you're going to college, it's a networking venue, and since information is unlimited, you're more so proving yourself literate and being stamped as being literate, not completely all the way versed. I worked with a professional in the school system, my first job as a school bus driver, and he was telling me some of the inside baseball about how school districts work. And he was telling me that in life, most jobs you have, most management, school system leadership, what have you. Most things, even maybe something technical, a person can be trained in on it without a degree. A person can be competent in it without a degree. Degree still serves something as a bar, like a literacy test. And then also when you go up for different tests, right? Like say you go up to drive a bus, right? A school bus, or like a professional license of something to do with CDL. Even not non-CDL, like even like a different type of vehicle that needs an endorsement or a grading. You have to pass like an exam of like a written exam, a multiple choice written exam. And a lot of the information you get there, it's not exactly all of what your training is to operate that way, and you don't entirely use or even recall a lot of that. When I was in college, I went to a strong college, in a state college in the next state over, and I had this excellent teacher of history who would tell it like it is. She would just tell us the inside. She would tell us what the textbooks say, and then she would tell us the real ass shit at the same breath. She would say, yeah, this is what you need to know for the class, but this is how it may happen, and I actually don't know all of how it happened, but this is the type of bullshit that's in these books. And she told us that about, you're only going to remember about 5 or 10% of anything that you learn in college. A lot of it, you may recall it for a few days, but since you're not using it, we have a long-term and short-term memory, and we dispense with things we're not using as a point of being viable and keeping the buoyancy between consciousness and unconsciousness. So most of the things you will come across, they do land in your subconscious, and you can't unsee things. Your unconscious and subconscious, you can't unsee things and unknow things once you're familiar with them. However, you may not be cognizant or versed in them or have a command of them. And so from that standpoint, you only recall about 5 or 10% of being in college, but you do remember a lot of the college experience. So that you've went to college, a lot of these different professional like licensing that you'd go up for, maybe even stuff like accounting, like a test to become an accountant or a test of some kind of license. A lot of what it actually is still a literacy test, in that you would have to be versed around literacy to pass that, or be familiar with what is looked for and sought for in literacy tests to pass that well. So a lot of these colleges, they get you literate enough to, there are a lot of things that are outstanding that can be accomplished with literacy that cannot be otherwise. That would be a video title unto itself. But these colleges, they're networking venues. They get you some of the actual the social experiences, the sexual experiences that would have you, or at least in the vicinity of that would have you competent and have a convincing bearing and appeal. That would part of being sexually and socially viable is actually part of paternalism. So to sometimes, like even when we're a child and we're observing whether we respect our parents or not, some of it is actually the swag of our parents. And I don't mean to be inappropriate as saying a child appreciating their own parents' sexual appeal, but something of we are sexual beings in this life, human beings, and something is your aura, or your charisma and your viability. A lot of your viability with a partner in life is partly your ability to say no to them, also to a child. That is, your ability to be appreciated and well liked by other people would amount to a form of leverage, and that is respected by people in life, but no less than your own family members and even dependents. So something of sexual aura, charisma and sexual charisma is part of what is inculcated in these colleges. And I think that might be some of like the hazing and the kind of the closed door fraternal type of bonding exercises, both same sex and opposite sex, that would be both sanctioned and then also maybe imitated for being sanctioned, where a lot of people, they feel like because they're on a college campus, they would need to be, or they'd be viable, or it'd be part of the experience to have the sexual experiences of a college. And that might not be different than what a college is for, because the college is for having that all ride pass to society, that is being literate, in the oldest sense, that would be being white, non-colored. So in all these different these societies that have experienced colonialism, you have different degrees and different iterations of colorism, both in the United States, the Caribbean, and South Africa, and it's been very severe. But it's also been unique to each one of those. And there's a book on the Rastafarians but it goes back into the history of Jamaica in order to give the context for who and what the Rastafaris were and are. That it was written in about the time of the 1990s. I'll reference that in the video in the description. It was written around the time of the late 80s, 90s by some of the living remaining original Rastas, as that was appreciated by the author, the remnants that he could discover in Jamaica. from anywhere from like the 30s, 40s, and 50s era, and he found some verifiable people of the lineage. As I think there may have been a wane of it around the 90s. I'm not a historian, but according to this book, it would seem like that. And to him, you cannot appreciate who the Rastas are without the context of subsistence farming in Jamaica and the ruggedness of the Jamaican terrain, and what crops would and wouldn't be viable, what means of independence would and wouldn't be viable, what leverage that amounted to for land-holding people and land-serving people, people subsisting off the lands, both those having capital and entitlements, and those bartering their labor for access to some of the privileges of like food and shelter that would be in the command of the people with the entitlement to the land. You cannot appreciate who the Rastas are without that context, according to that book. But you also cannot appreciate what social implications and reality would constitute without an appreciation for colorism, because the colorism was very heavy in Jamaica. It was also like that in Africa, where I come from, where my father comes from, and the colored people, who would be, for lack of a better word, mulatto people in South Africa, in Namibia, and maybe other parts of Africa. They're almost like a unique class unto themselves, and they also have attitudes that would go with their experience, for better or worse. Part of my family's those people, that family I referenced, part of their facility with other people, myself, and no less than law enforcement officers, is because Namibia is a coastal country, and a lot of the economics are predicated around coastal dynamics. My father was born around a very famous coastal city, and I think that's actually where that family was from, or near thereabout. And if you go to coastal cities the world over, but especially there, maybe another example would be like New Orleans or even New York City. You have so many people coming in and out from different areas, that so much traffic, that it necessitates a form of shorthand language that is like shorthand communication, the bare minimum to communicate. That's actually very eloquent in a way. If you appreciate what's called like African American, foundational Black American language, a lot of it is actually more sophisticated, more direct, more efficient, more forceful, and more eloquent and more graceful than what would be considered proper English. Language in necessitates different assumptions. For me to express myself in such a way that I am calculating I may be understood by another person, but for me to go from without to within another person to back without by anticipating who another person is, their background, what they would and would not appreciate, engaging them, appreciating their response, reassessing, and then further engaging them, that requires assumption on different levels. So you could say that a lot of proper language would be like a positive assumption, that I am this important that I can communicate this way. I am this important that I need to say this much, that I can say this much, that I can say this little, that I would need to say this little. That's part of the assumptions that would go into communication that smacks distasteful sometimes when people just don't click right. But you're in a coastal city, and you can't afford to have deals go bad. You need to get along with people to a degree, because life does require cooperation. I told someone yesterday that none of us, I don't think, are independent, and codependence is the devil, like what I experienced with like transference with influential people when I was young. But interdependence is what we're going for, and what the great outcome is. So you would need interdependence, and you couldn't get by it in the past without it when you got mouths to feed, including your own mouth. So you need to be smooth, you need to be effective, you need to be accurate with your socializing and engagement in a coastal city in life, but in a coastal city in particular, that necessitates shorthand. An example would be like, I was thinking of something yesterday. What would be a perfect phrase of that I thought of? Like, it was something I was saying yesterday with like if someone said, so you got that new purple bandana? Oh no, I've been had this. When I say I've been had this, that's a little bit of shorthand, because if I would have said, no, I already had this, that sounds like, if I said I already had this before, that might be more I actually use more words, and it doesn't actually convey the fact that, no, I've been having this for a while. There's actually a phrase called old hat. So when something's not new anymore, it's old hat. So I'm saying old hat with that. So no, I've been had this. this is old hat right here. It's nothing new to me. This is not my first rodeo. When I said no, I've been had this. That's an example of shorthand, and that's a lot of the eloquence of the foundational Black American language. Is that foundational Black Americans in the brutality of slavery wouldn't be tolerated to say, no sir, I already had this article, this garment and article of no sir, I had already previously obtained this article of garment for fashioning for fashioning style and for maintaining my body temperature against the adversities of the winter that we're facing this year, sir. I would sound way the hell too important and even entitled in a brutal system such as slavery. That's actually true to today. Right now, I'm making this video from about less than a quarter mile away from one of my former jobs. No, that's sketchy. I'm not laying on my former job. It's the weekend, so nobody else is there right now. But this is actually a cool place to do some gig work. So I was over here to do some work. But when I was at that role, I had to communicate a lot on the radio. And when I would do so, I would speak straightforward, and also I've read a lot, and I went to these schools where I had to like write papers and do multiple choice tests. So I would think that like speaking my understanding of professionalism and clear would be a strong suit. And some of the veterans at these jobs, they would approach me and they would appreciate how I conducted myself on the radio, especially in nuanced and situations with a lot of responsibility and viability and potential danger, both professionally and for the people that I would care for. Like when there would be oversights in communication between a set of parents with dual custody and where they wanted a child dropped off and where they had arranged with the child to be dropped off, versus where the route copy said where the dispatch would have me drop them when I told them what the route copy said was different than what the parents would have. Stuff like that, stuff that's very nuanced like that, requires clear communication. Over communicating can be a problem too, as much as under communicating or sounding over entitled or even over professional. That's for me now with the civil rights that we have, but I can imagine in the past that would have been hellified stronger. So that would account for some of the shorthand. But in these coastal cities, it's common to have that shorthand and actually the eloquence like that. So these friends were like that. But my friend, the older brother, he spoke like that in the first place. He was multilingual, but he was also raised in the suburbs of Roseville. I've said that according to so what I want to say is that according to Taj Tariq Bey, is that you had a Moorish presence in the Africas and the Americas and Spain before what we're told in the books. To him, the Spanish language is a Romance language that is a Latin language, but it sounds a little bit smoother, if we're being frank, than the other Latin languages. Maybe not necessarily smoother or more romantic than French, but unique from all of them. Spanish does. According to Taj Tariq Bey, that's because Spanish is a iteration and version of Moorish Latin. That is, the Moorish language filtered through Latin, and the Latin filtered through the Moorish language. The presence and influence of the Moorish people in Spain is some of what's responsible for the way that Spanish sounds and lends itself to communication and romance in life. Because of that, the Moors are from Africa. My father speaks over Heredo, which is a Bantu language. Most of your languages in the like the southern part of Africa, the whole southern part of Africa. I don't know so much about. I think South Africa, they might have. I don't know if you would have maybe a little bit of different influence. But by and large, Southern Africa is the Bantu language family. So the fact that my father speaks both Oshi Heredo and Oshi Ovambo, many of them are the same words to translate, but he's also had social workers here from Rwanda, and he can pick out words that they would say, and he can pick out words from other parts of Africa, because according to him, the Heredo people themselves migrated from like even around the region of Kenya, that far up north, not that many years back. So the languages are related to that. That they would be related to Spanish is not a far cry or a random. It's not capricious to think that it could be related to Spanish. If Spanish is appreciated as Moorish Latin, and the Moors are appreciated as having a presence and emanating from Africa, but also being highly mobile, the Moors being mobile enough to reach Spain before Spain reached Africa. And also according to Taj Tariq Bey's Africa, I think Europe might be called Iberia, or at least Spain is called Iberia. and it's not actually different than Africa. And you'd have people like the Picts, I think, that actually had pigment just like Africa in Europe. That's a lesser known history. But according to him, there's also a deeper relationship between India and the Native Americans of why they would be called the Indians. I said in another video, it might not be a coincidence that Christopher Columbus chartered his flight, his dispatch from Spain, that was contacted and actually had been conquered by the Moors, and the Moors are known to be seafaring. That Christopher Columbus would have an idea of where the Americas are, enough to get lost there, but yet conveniently find his way directly back. I'm not a historian, but that there would be a little bit deeper insight there. And according to Tashrik Bey, the Spanish, his conquest was appreciated as designated for India, seeking spices. That's what we were told. Because the Spaniards landed successfully on the Americas, designated them the Native Americans, but had been chartered to go to India. That in itself shows that there's something of a relationship between India and the America that may not have made its way into the history books. According to Tashrik Bey, it's deeper than that, but he didn't entirely articulate it, and neither can I. But all I meant to say is that some of the people with the most subtle perception that I've ever encountered in spiritual matters, scientific matters, health matters, social matters, art, music, some of the people, the human family with an appreciation and a command and knack for laying a finger on something that's right in front of our nose that whole time, like looking for our keys in our hand, had been the people of India. Also in the United States, people that I have encountered that have the sharpest command of regional differences, that is understanding the land and the people upon it, even the people that impose themselves upon it, the actual real politics of a city or of a land. That would be your Native Americans and your Latinos, who are also can be appreciated as Native Americans. I would appreciate Latinos as Native Americans, but with some of the Spanish European ancestry, but also your Native Americans in North America and Canada may have a lot of European ancestry also, honestly speaking. But the people with the most command for the actual nuances of the land and the people upon it, and the politics, both the overt politics and the de facto underlying politics, and how those inform one another, had been Hispanic people. So I was actually doing my taxes with a Hispanic brother, and he was, one thing is that he was appreciating how many numbers I had put up for like my independent work, because he knew what that would mean. He's also independent. He was telling me the way cooler platforms to engage for 1099. And then I was telling him where my high school was, which is actually the same high school as Philando Castile. I think I might have attended with him. I was class of 2004. I'm not sure if he would have been there, but he would have known some of the same upperclassmen as I did. And I was well known to a lot of upperclassmen there because of an inroad I had from my best friend's older sister. But that man, that Hispanic man, we were in the area of Midway, which is also the area where that high school that Philando Castile and I both attended, St. Paul Central. And he said, when I was asking him, someone got around to asking if he could tell where I was from, he said, "Yeah, you're from Roseville." Dead on. No, but I've actually lived in a lot of places, because when I was a boy, I grew up in a neighborhood called Cedar Riverside in Minneapolis, which is it's near Dinkytown in the West Bank, so it's near the University of Minnesota, as almost a city unto itself. That a little bit plays into the atrocities of Philando Castile, some of the dynamics of the zoning in the city to my taste. But that Cedar Riverside is where I had grown up. It is a very African neighborhood. If you tell anyone with my appearance and my name that you had grown up around Cedar Riverside, they would think that you may be African if they would hear that. But my father was also from Africa, and I grew up there for my first 5 years. And I had some really cool experiences, because my best friends who lived the next house over, their dad was a biker, or a real bike. He was a foundational Black American, but he was a real biker, and he was cool enough to be a biker. And some of my coolest experiences were around that family, and he would take me on that motorcycle, and those motorcycles really spoke to me. A parked motorcycle would speak to me as a child, not in words, but I could feel accepted, respected, and loved by a motorcycle. Somehow, even the angle that it would be parked at with the wheel turned like that, that was my experience of motorcycles back then. And I still feel a way about motorcycles. I want to do a video about that. But that had been my experience then. Then I went out to the Southwest for elementary. Then I came back to St. Paul. But when I came back to St. Paul, I was always hanging out with my friends in Roseville, that is near the University of Minnesota, Lauderdale area. that attended the Roseville schools, and also getting a little bit into Mounds View and Shoreview, which are not far away. Which I served Mounds View and Shoreview as a bus driver later, but we were always around Roseville. But I met them because my family met them in Cedar Riverside when I was young. But then and then in high school for junior year, I went to a high school in a suburb of Memphis called Germantown, but it's still near the Memphis city line, the Memphis metro area. And then I came back and lived most of my life in St. Paul after that. But when I came back, I was a young man, and I was at these African parties, and I was still influenced by some of these Roseville type guys, where they have a way of speaking where they would speak almost like a suburban person would, almost a little bit. They were called preppy playboys, those people I hung out with, and they actually were something of playboys and something preppy, but they were comfortable around almost anyone of any background, from like a person from an inner city background, a police officer. That sounds kind of funny to say, like they're comfortable around everyone, even a police officer, but they would be comfortable with someone from almost any walk of life, any age or stature of life. They'd be comfortable with them, and they would engage them speaking kind of clear and almost a little bit proper. So some of the way that I would communicate myself on these radios, it's not necessarily a function of growing up in these or of going to some of these colleges later, but some of my ability to matriculate into the colleges as a non-traditional student exists within there, fare well within them, and then fare as a professional with some of the battery of literacy tests and interviews that you have to go through to land professional roles, and also sustain jobs to have a track record to land professional roles. That's actually a function of growing around these Roseville type dudes. And actually, the way that I would engage a police officer to this day is actually the way that a Roseville playboy, a Roseville player, not to designate myself a playboy, because you can't designate yourself certain things. I've been designated different things: ninja, biker, badass. Some people have called me a G, but I don't affiliate with anything. But when I was a leader at Job Corps, which is Job Corps is about. Philando Castile was slain on Larpenteur about 2 blocks. He's slain on Larpenteur about 2 long city blocks east of Snelling and Larpenteur. Snelling is a main artery. Famous Fort Snelling of Minnesota goes from Fort Snelling around the Mississippi River north across St. Paul straight to Roseville, and beyond Roseville is Snelling. And then Larpenteur goes east and west from about Minneapolis to it's actually Broadway in Minneapolis, and it goes way to the famous North Minneapolis, which is a long historical black neighborhood that has a foundational black American neighborhood that has very strong reputation, both in beautiful cultural aesthetics, but also some hard things. Is the reputation of North Minneapolis, and then it goes all the way across Minneapolis as Broadway. It goes way where I'm at now. I'm now in the northern suburbs near Brooklyn Park and Robbinsdale. And there's a road called Bottineau, Highway 81 Bottineau, that's named after a French trapper. Then Bottineau goes into Minneapolis and becomes Broadway. Broadway itself is very famous and renowned. That has maybe one of the most street cred of any streets. I'm not saying it's better than any street, because there's all kinds of neighborhoods in the Twin Cities that are no punks. South Minneapolis, East St. Paul, West St. Paul. There's no punks anywhere no street is anything to play with. So I'm not ranking nothing, but most people would be familiar with Broadway and what Broadway can mean in terms of culture and lifestyles. Then as you follow that, it comes through the University of Minnesota area, some of your residential, a lot of student family housing and student housing in the University of Minnesota. Then it crosses an industrial place, kind of like a no man's land of businesses, very near where we were at those apartments in the Lauderdale area, and it becomes Larpenteur, and then it goes through St. Paul, through the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota with some farmlands. So a lot of people may not know that Philando Castile was actually slain about less than a half a mile or a quarter mile away from actual farm country in the middle of St. Paul. With like greenhouses and farmhouses as part of the University of Minnesota, that a little bit plays into my history around there. That might be significant in itself, that people might not know that he was slain that close to farm area within the middle of the metro area, where this metro area is It's a sprawling, maybe I don't want to say 30, 40, 50 square mile radius, or circumference, is the Twin Cities metro area. With the population has been growing a lot, but in the almost the dead center of it, or at least maybe towards the northern reaches of it, would be still St. Paul proper, all these overlapping places, but you actually have farmland there, expansive farmland, somewhat crops, corn in the middle of the city, about half a mile or quarter mile from where Orlando Castile was slain. But then as you follow that Larpenteur, it goes back to the east side of St. Paul, which the east side has another formidable reputation in terms of history and heritage, and it's also a traditionally black neighborhood. The east side the east side is to the north. The west side is to the south. Those are very staunch, sturdy, historical neighborhoods. The east side more so predominantly black, but also largely Hmong and Hispanic. The Hmong people were similar or close near about like the Laotian people and the Vietnamese people, and they actually, I think they may have assisted the American forces and the South Vietnamese forces in the conflict in Vietnam, and some of them, they had reciprocity and standing and a ticket to citizenship and immigration during and after the Vietnam conflict, where you have a strong concentration and presence of Hmong people in the United States, particularly in California and Minnesota, at least. Maybe other places, but I know that California and Minnesota have a history of reciprocity with the Hmong people, and a lot of Hmong people that you would meet here, they have a history going back to California. I'm not very well familiar with the Hmong culture, because a lot of them, they'll show you respect. They're outstanding people to live with, work with, and deal with, but their culture is a little bit, they somewhat protect themselves, almost similar to like the Native Americans, where they're not one to trifle with or divulge their way of doing things. But I know that you have at least two dialects of Hmong, like white Hmong and green Hmong, which maybe roughly speaking like someone from the north or someone from the south in America. But I don't know what the actual politics are or what the tastes are of those. But I know that those are two distinctions among Hmong, is white Hmong and green Hmong. And then they also, and that would affect how they speak the language and maybe how they associate with each other. And then also they have like some really delicious food called like sticky rice. It's like this ball of rice, and they're really generous. Like I worked with this cold dude. He worked with me on the east side over there as a pizza driver for a while, and he's the type of person where like if he tells you about something cool that he eats that's cool, he's gonna. We were working our asses off. We would go to work at about 3 or 4 in the afternoon, work till 3 or 4 in the morning, sleep, rinse, wash, repeat, like that. And we were doing that, and he found out I like sticky rice, and he got up early before the afternoon, waking up in the afternoon to make me some sticky rice and bring it to work before we start. Oh yeah, here go that sticky rice you wanted, like stuff like that. That's how sturdy some of your Hmong people would be. When I came up in school, I grew up with a lot of Hmong people. I never had a problem with a Hmong person, and if I would have, I would be the one standing down and coughing on my pride, because they're cool ass people, but they're not nobody to play with. Nobody is. But then you have like a lot of Somalian people also, and I think you have a presence of Somalian people, reciprocity, like in maybe the Atlanta area, and then the Minnesota. I don't know where else, but Somalian people have a strong presence in the Minnesota along with the Hmong people. But then that would be the east side would be more the north, and then the west side would be actually geographically more so south. But then the middle of that, coming back towards Minneapolis west, was a famous area called Rondo. It's a famous Rondo neighborhood. So someone that knows St. Paul, if I tell them that I'm from Central, this actually happened to me yesterday. I was telling someone, I don't go around blasting Central, but I met someone my exact same age yesterday who's a cool person, and he asked me where I went, and I said I went to Central. He's like, also you grew up around Selby. Now I didn't associate with Selby. I wasn't with any Selby cliques, but I grew up on St. Paul Central was on a street called Marshall, which is about maybe 3 blocks is parallel and 3 blocks north of Selby. Selby crosses St. Paul. But it terminates at the river at a college campus called St. Thomas by the river west. But then it goes from the river west to downtown. But Selby has a lot of history, and that would, even Marshall has a lot of history too. But Selby has a certain name to it. That name has a certain ring to it. But then the name is a little bit different. It's not. Selby got gentrified. A lot of it did. So, Selby was part of the Rondo neighborhood. I actually don't know what the streets of the Rondo neighborhood would have been, but I know that exactly as you go from the river west St. Paul. It's not called West St. Paul, but it's the actual west extent of St. Paul where it meets Minneapolis, which is west of St. Paul. From there to downtown, and then beyond downtown to the east, going to the east side, the lower and upper east side, and then to the suburbs like Woodbury and Oakdale. You have that from Minneapolis to downtown, parallel to Marshall, which St. Paul Central with Orlando Castillo and I attended, and actually my home is about less than a mile away from that school, and very close to Selby. I lived a few blocks away from Selby for a long time, but I was never associated with Selby or on the block of Selby. But that along there is Freeway Interstate 94, and they actually gutted the Rondo neighborhood in order to do that, and that was a problem in the past because that was clear gentrification back then. But some of the streets survived the gentrification, such as Selby and Marshall to the south of 94, as it skirts east and west from St. Paul, from the river of Minneapolis to downtown. And then a few blocks north of that, also parallel, you would have Midway to the west by St. Paul, and then as you go east towards downtown, you have Frogtown. And Frogtown has a lot of reputation, but also seasoning in class. You can recognize someone from Frogtown by some of their confidence. I've met a lot of really confident people from Frogtown. There's something unique about people from Frogtown where they believe in themselves, and they are almost beautiful for their self-respect, more beautiful than you could be with swagger, for their simple self-respect. People not affiliated with anything that I know, but just some sturdy guys I knew from Frogtown. But Frogtown, Rondo, they have something called Rondo Days, which is similar to Juneteenth. It happens along Juneteenth. Rondo, it has a place called Pilgrim Baptist Church. I'm not sure how old Pilgrim Baptist Church is. I went to something called The Living Word, which was from a pastor from North Minneapolis. He's from the South, but he lived in North Minneapolis, like maybe the 80s, and then in the 90s or so, or the 80s, he established something called The Living Word, which is influential on the very west extent of Minneapolis on Marshall. As you go to the bridge, it was located along Marshall, and then they migrated to a place also parallel to Marshall, but closer to University, which also skirts parallel to 94. Exactly, Marshall skirts parallel to 94 south, at east and west. Also, it's located south, parallel south of 94, and then parallel north of 94 is University, but the historic church, or the church that helped me out a lot was The Living Word on Marshall. But then Marshall is the same street that our high school, St. Paul Central, was located about 2 miles east of that. Philando George and I attended there. And then, but that itself, Central, it sits on, I said that Snelling is a northwest vein of, a north-south vein of St. Paul. Exactly about a mile east of that, parallel to Snelling, is Lexington. Lexington is St. Paul Central is located on Lexington and Marshall, about 1 block south of the 94 freeway. The 94 freeway is exactly where the historic neighborhood of Rondo was, and it has something there called Pilgrim Baptist Church, which was very influential and fed membership to the Living Word, and the Living Word also participated with Pilgrim Baptist. But some of there would be, like, I'm not trying to talk about hood politics because I'm not versed in it, but there would be, like, when I went to the Living Word, there would be people there that were from, like, they'd be more so of the hood that was a little bit more associated with Selby, which would be like south of 94 but parallel to 94. And then Pilgrim Baptist would have people that were associated with Frogtown, which was parallel but a little bit north of 94, like 2 blocks north of 94, parallel to 94 would be Frogtown. 2 blocks south of 94, parallel to 94, would be Selby. And when we went to some of these youth things, some of them, they would be back then they didn't use the word ops as much, but they would, like, be each other's ops, at a actual youth church going on, but they'd be somewhat at peace because it was a church venue, because that the church was central to the black community there. And back then, like the early 2000s, Selby felt like the black community, Frogtown felt like the black community. It still does, but Selby more so has been gentrified a lot since I was back then. When I was back in school, I always had the cleanest fades. Everyone gave me props about my haircut, my fades. I had met a barber in Frogtown, but then he migrated to Selby, and I followed him to Selby, and he would give me the cleanest fades. But when I went there, it felt like you were in the black community there. Like you really felt like people like popping in, like, hey man, what's up, man? I got some DVDs if y'all need them, or check out, I got some health drinks, stuff like that. Like the real like breaking bread, and I think they call it like bun cakes or something like that. Like hot pies, like stuff like that. Like real bartering. Like that's actually the real peace, the sense of beauty and peace that you would find in the black community at its best. To me, from my limited exposure growing up, I would appreciate that as a function of economics and like bartering is what gives you that kind of peace. Like, yeah, man, I'm not trying to hustle nobody or rob nobody, because I'm trying to break bread with you, and I'm trying to get you over past something. If you can help me get over past this little thing, that's our best shot at peace, I think, to this day for the broader society. But it's the black community. It felt like you were on Selby back then. Selby is still Selby, and I wouldn't play around there to this day, and it still is the black community. But I think that the black community has changed a little bit, because some of the black church has changed a little bit to my taste. I stopped attending the black church, and according to Dr. Umar Johnson, around that time of the 90s, the churches in the United States, they might have began receiving subsidies from what's called a 501c3 nonprofit. According to Tashreeq Bey, the lesser known full enunciation of that title is 501c3 nonprofit Skull and Bones organization. Is that they're tied into some of these good old boys clubs, and these more so secretive and fraternal or sister organizations or what have you, that fraternize and banter and collaborate and boycott. That's the main power of racism and segregation, and the power of power is actually boycotting. So these people get together in back rooms with cigars and whatnot, and it might be different with social media now, but they call the shots and they organize together to boycott things and make other things work, is what the significance of that. They also may hoard some of the actual real history and the real resources and the real understanding that would allow us to understand civics, history, language, even science, and ourselves and our reality differently from some of the ancients, like the Library of Alexandria and whatnot, that we're led to believe has been destroyed. According to Tashreeq Bey, some of these fraternal orders, they'd have access to that, and they actually be trained in that. And also, when they get together in their different different initiations, there's actually books about initiations that are available for public purchase, like books on the potence of initiation. One of them is a book called Understanding Manhood that compares training and recognition as a male bearing an adult bearing in different societies across cultures and ethnicities. You can learn a lot from that book, Manhood in the Making. But in Western society, some of our institutions, like schools generically, but then also higher order education, more so clandestine and efficiently behind closed doors, different professional organizations, they make a mock and an imitation of a real life experience that would initiate you and have you feel differently. When people look at you differently, you feel differently about yourself. You feel different about yourself for being looked at differently. That's part of the real function of an initiation, and now you actually are appreciably in another person for having been initiated for something. Going through something arduous, but being seen and seeing yourself being seen for something is an initiation, and that affects the person. Back in the day, you would actually have to go out into nature, and you'd have to survive that, and you'd have to be about that and do that to come back from that. Some of it involved like marauding and like commandeering other people's cattle, because your cattle was your means of livelihood, similar to your means of transportation now, or your footing as having a title to an apartment or a home. That would have been your cattle in the past, or maybe your buffalo with the Indian, or like my father's people, the Overhead Edo, the cattle, and how egregious when the German people, when they brutalized and overconsumed maybe the cattle, similar to the Native American with the buffalo, they actually were emancipating the people. That's part of the process of that, is because when you take away a person's means of subsistence, they must humble themselves to you, or they will cease to exist. When their women see them do that, they will lose respect for them. Then they will lose the support of their own women and the strength to stand up to different things. Their women will find themselves no option but to also submit to the people who are depriving them or abusing them, and then maybe learn to love them or enjoy loving them. That is humiliating and defeating to a man and the bearing of masculinity. But that's related to the cattle and how much of a problem that'd be for. So like I said, my father feels a type of way about cattle to this day. That might be some of it. That's enunciated in the book on the making of manhood. But then also more so of your Western society. Some of these initiations, they may be along the lines of academic undertakings, professional undertakings, such as dog-eat-dog intellectual competition with other entitled and privileged students. Who's willing to go the mile, who's willing to fight that hard to be entitled and have the all access pass to society. But then also it's a little bit more arbitrary, where it's pretentious and it's put on. And so in some of their doing that in these fraternal orders, they'd actually put on the wig of the Moorish people. So like if you remember like if you can conceive or imagine the plantation owners or your justices like John Hamilton, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin. If you can remember, they have these curly wigs. Now European people don't have curly hair like that, generally speaking. According to Tashriq Bey, they were mocking and imitating the actual visual presentation of the Moorish people, which would have been very formidable and a very masculine bearing, similar to the dreads of the Rasta would have been like the curls of the Moorish people. And that's actually what they mock in secrecy in these fraternal orders, because they still recognize the potence of those people and some of their science and heritage. And according to Tashriq Bey, a lot of what we have for science and technology is reverse engineered or inspired by some of the understanding that was attained and documented by ancient people, the Moorish people, but also people like Kush in different societies, is that they actually have some of this knowledge, and that's what some of our advances are based upon, and also some of our civics. But that's not my hill, and I'm not actually entirely concerned with that. All I meant to say is that you still have like some of those that type of stuff going on, and that by these churches accepting money that is part of the government that also has these backdoor rooms, these cigar-filled rooms, such as what would be called Skull and Bones, 501c3 Skull and Bones. It dilutes the message, and it also affects what stance a preacher can take, and what stance a preacher can appreciate a member for taking, and how that would affect the bottom line. All that is very significant, according to Dr. Umar Johnson. I'm sorry, Dr. Umar Johnson had pointed out the nonprofit, but Tashriq Bey had pointed out that it's referred to as Skull and Bones with that. So I a little bit digress with that one, but so I did completely digress with that, but I was talking about the so that may have weakened the black church. And because when I was growing up in the time when I was a young person in the early 2000s, I was a late high schooler and young man, and I was interested in becoming a better person and learning from the church, especially the testimony and the worship of real life saints who had been from all different backgrounds, white collar, blue collar, street, well-to-do, sheltered, all that. The real people who real believers, and what they would have to say. I appreciated that then, but some of those, you might have had some of the older cadre that had experienced the black church before some of the politics and the financing changed. So I was benefited by that. They're probably still there, but it may have more of the influence of the nonprofit contributions now, such that some experience of the black community is different than it would be there, and different things that fly or wouldn't fly, like maybe in terms of violence or whatnot. You've always had that violence, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Is like, even back in the 90s, like when I was growing up around Roseville, there was a gangster culture across the United States of all walks of life. Suburban kids, inner city kids. You might say that any one of them could have been living more or less of it than the other. And also you had like a lot of busing, where you could be at a suburban school and you could be friends with someone from an inner city or whatnot. So just because you're in the suburbs doesn't mean that you're more or less of a gangster background in the past. But the 90s had a very strong gangster culture, so there was as much gangsterism then and potentially violence then. my brother thought that we see a lot of stuff in the news now about like different like very sad and unfortunate acts of violence. But my brother was thinking that that stuff happened as much back then, but you didn't have as much like social media and access to cameras. But there was a lot of violence in the 90s. But some of your suburban kids, they could be more, they could get into trouble for the sake of getting into trouble, because they had, I appreciated growing up that they had something to prove. Some of those people I was around in the suburbs, not necessarily my friends and family, but the people that would be in the neighborhoods around there, is that you had a lot of maybe like gangsterism where it wasn't entirely called for. And sometimes suburban kids can get into a lot of trouble and also be savvy. Sometimes suburban kids, they're still in high school, but they got their own cars and they know certain ways to do things that may not be appreciated as like upstanding. So your suburban kids, they can be as savvy and then maybe also as dangerous and deadly as someone from the inner city. But it's just along different rules of engagement in the suburb lifestyle, but no less serious. The streets are the streets, whether you're in the suburbs or the city, to my taste. But this brother, he had this Hispanic brother, this Latino brother that was doing my taxes. He could peep game right away that I would have to be talking like a Roseville type guy to be talking like that. And he's not even from the Twin Cities, but he could peep that right away. But that's actually how we communicated and how we would have been talking to these cops along Larpenteur. But I think that a lot of people, if you appreciate somebody from the Twin Cities, they would a lot of people would say that, okay, so Minneapolis, it makes sense when you drive different places because there's a rhyme and reason to the streets. Like they're numbered off, and then the street names, a lot of them are alphabetical. So if you're looking for something, you can tell what you already passed up or what you need to find just based on the number or the name of the street, as in the alphabetical ordering. I think that's true both in the north and south, but some of the numbers they repeat and they reiterate as you go north to south. But more so, Minneapolis is more so straightforward and organized as the names of the streets go. There's a lot of sophisticated one-ways that can be complex, but there's a rhyme and reason to it. St. Paul, on the other hand, is very arbitrary to a lot of people's taste, and there's a lot of, I appreciate that in this country, there's still a little bit of a lingering racism or a little bit of bigotry toward Irish people. Like a lot of people, both white and black, like they still have a lot of jokes about Irish people. So I imagine that in the past, the Irish people had a little bit more of a tough road. I'm not saying they had it any better or rough than anyone, but there may have been something significant about how Americans viewed the Irish people going back, maybe also other people, European people such as the Italians. But the Irish people, a lot of people, they make a lot of derogatory jokes about the Irish. I would say I more so always hear derogatory humor, if anything, if I hear something about the Irish people. I don't often hear well-to-do people that have well things to say about Irish people. I'm actually part Irish. My mother is about 3/4 Irish and 1/4 German. A little bit of Welsh, but more so mostly Irish and a little bit, but significantly German. Her mother was half Irish and German, and her father was completely Irish. But they say that St. Paul, they always joke that it was the streets were made by drunken Irishmen because they don't make sense. My grandfather was an Irishman, and he had a problem with alcohol, and he also lived in the Highland area, which was highly segregated. So what I meant to say is that I think that some of the sophistication of the zoning of the Twin Cities, the fact that they're positioned on two rivers, that they would even need to make two cities upon two rivers. It actually has two downtowns. So as you sometimes you can stand in one position and you can see two downtowns. I used to work cleaning downtown, and from the upper building, I could look straight and see another downtown and a spectacular view from downtown Minneapolis to downtown St. Paul. A lot of times when I'm getting on the highway around that 280 part, around the west extent of St. Paul, as the St. Paul meets the river, I have a clear view of downtown Minneapolis. And so a lot of times I'll have the view of two different downtowns. A lot of people might think that nothing of that, but it's actually significant because I would say that a lot of times, by and large, people in Minneapolis, generally speaking, have more to do with Minneapolis, even though something might be closer in St. Paul. Sometimes, like, I would need guitar strings recently. I live more so and have lived more so by the Mac Groveland area, which is the next neighborhood south of the Selby neighborhood. So you got the Rondo neighborhood that used to be Frogtown and Selby, but now because of 94 gentrifying that, you have Frogtown, then 94, then Selby. Then, as you stayed at the northeast of St. Paul proper, prior to downtown, you have the Crocus Hill neighborhood. parallel and just directly south of the Selby neighborhood, which our high school, St. Paul Central, is on Marshall, part of the Selby neighborhood. Directly south of the Marshall Selby neighborhood, you have the Mac Groveland area. Then as you go, that's directly south of the Selby neighborhood. As you go a little bit west, you get into like the St. Thomas Tommy neighborhood of St. Thomas, which is, it doesn't popularize itself, but a lot of your well-to-do people in the state of Minnesota, they're sending their children there to St. Thomas, where my father taught and my aunt was a student, and they're having a lot of success, and that's a very strong school, a Catholic school. St. Paul is largely Catholic with that Irish background, and my grandfather was a staunch Catholic, and my family was raised in parochial Catholic schools, some famous Catholic schools in St. Paul, strong in sports but also strong in academics. And if I meet people from a real background in St. Paul, like even my landlord, they are familiar with where my mom went to school, and they would have a certain respect for my mom based on the fact that she went to that school. And that helped me. My landlord has stepped up for me different times, and part of it is actually the favor that she has towards me as being my mom's son, who is who went to these parochial schools. So these parochial schools, they have pull in the area. Then as you go south of that, you have like a Jewish neighborhood next to south of that would be Highland neighborhood, south of Matt Groveland. And then you would have like the Highland Village by the river, and then you have like the West 7th area, where the West 7th is a little bit multicultural, but you also have a strong Jewish presence, and that Jewish presence would be present in Highland Village a lot. And I met some very influential people when I worked as a clerk there for some years. But all I meant to say is that St. Paul is very sophisticated in terms of the nuance of the neighborhoods you would be in socioeconomically that could be appreciated as redlining. The experience of the Twin Cities is still very highly segregated, but it's more sophisticated than simply ethnicity or skin tone or even appearance. It's way deeper class, socioeconomic redlining, and who gets on with who gets along with who, stuff like that. So there's very sophisticated nuance in the zoning of where you would and wouldn't be. George Floyd, he was slain about. So as you take Marshall, the street that the high school that Philando Castile and I attended, as you take Marshall, it crosses there's a few significant bridges there's many bridges that cross St. Paul to Minneapolis. One of them famously crashed before Philando Castile was slain. I think that was the I-35 bridge, maybe about 10 years ago or so. That bridge crashed for no reason. In broad daylight. A lot of times you think the in Minnesota I think they have a strong infrastructure, generally speaking, yet a bridge up and crashed. That actually might be significant because that would speak to how much traffic we have going between St. Paul and Minneapolis, and why do we have so much St. Paul traffic going between Minneapolis and St. Paul, and what is the difference between Minneapolis and St. Paul? That may have been a foreboding, and just to point out that it's significant, the fact that St. Paul and Minneapolis exist together with almost like a middle finger to each other, like two step twins that don't get along. There's kind of like a low-key animosity between St. Paul and Minneapolis. I'm not trying to stir up any beef, but a lot of people would appreciate that St. Paul and Minneapolis they can be different than each other, and they appreciate themselves for being different than each other. I've said that it's known, if you spend time here, you get to learn the politics. When I was at a base about a quarter mile from here, some old timers at the base, some veteran drivers and paras that assist with the routes, up in their 60s, early to mid 60s, they got to talking about St. Paul and the fact that I was from there. They're like, yeah, if I ever had someone visit, I'd take them to downtown. If I had someone visit me here in St. Paul, I'd take them to downtown St. Paul and check out the caves, the Wabasha caves, because those used to be speakeasies. Those are where the gangsters go. They said there's still ghosts there that cry. Those are the gangsters that got killed. Some of your gangsters from St. Paul, from Chicago, like Al Capone, I think, they would come up to St. Paul as a duck away, hide away, to tuck away money and get out and lay low from the heat in the Midwest, because St. Paul was like, they had a cozy relationship with the police officers in St. Paul, according as word on as the old timers would have it. But that wasn't the case with Minneapolis, because the politics of Minneapolis were different along the police officers. Even back then, at the time of the Prohibition, the Minneapolis police were something of different type of gangsters in the St. Paul. a lot of people wouldn't appreciate gangsterism as police, and also that gangsterism and police would be from New York City. Now, a lot of people like the gangster culture that I spoke about in the 90s that was prolific when I was growing up, especially with the children a little bit older than me, but filtering down to my extent of the children older than me were the latter generation X and just the beginning of the millennials, but more so latter generation X. My generation was the millennials, but your generation Xers, a lot of them were actually about the gang stuff because gangs were very popular. The music was gangs, the movies was gangs. And so a lot of that was, I understand, was from California culture, like LA LA pioneered some of the gangster culture that proliferated around the United States. But before that, way before that, in New York City, you had a lot of close neighborhoods and boroughs, like similar to what I'm talking about in St. Paul, and they would be when you have people living so close together and you have goings on, you have a necessity for sophisticated politics that would facilitate commerce and living the terms of peace. Because anywhere you have value, you will have honesty and dishonesty. That you have patrons, shoppers, consumers. You have merchants, vendors, owners, a tenant. You have tenants and owners. But then you'll also have like a criminal class, whether they're forced to participate or they're trained to or they choose to. You'll have piracy with any form of value. So that necessitates actually a form of gang politics. In the past, that would be your community. Your real community would be the people that would have say so about what's right and wrong, because the gun has the final say so. Before that had been the sword would have the say so, and then maybe the spear or even the rock would have the say so going back, and the numbers with that. So you may have also always had gang politics, but according to Todd Streak Bay, the actual the police officers, which are a fraternal organization in the United States, can be appreciated and also called. Also known as the gangs of New York, and they may emanate the actual politics and the style of doing business of police business. It may have emanated from the New York City area, according to Todd Streak Bay, and would be called the gangs of New York. So when you have police officer in different areas, they're actually gangs, the gangs of New York, professional criminals. They pay homage to, and they're within the auspices and oversight of state values, ostensibly, as they conduct business above board. We don't know all the business they conduct, but you have above board. Then you have finer organizations above board that can do more sophisticated, fine, exact, and also terrible implements of justice that is self-righteous, self-appointed de facto justice in some of your three-letter organizations. The FBI would be national, and then the CIA would be abroad, and they actually have a license to kill and a license to make license and a license to make laws and throw away laws and change laws. So they say what happens, but they don't have to explain themselves or even account or be known for doing something. They don't have to explain anything. They just simply can kill stuff or make stuff go away. And they actually may have perfected torture, according to Naomi Klein. She did a book called No Logos, where she talks about the brutality, but also the sophistication and power of big business, big pharma, big auto, all this stuff, big chemical. They've done crazy stuff, horrible stuff, heinous stuff that affects human life and outcomes. Both they're transnational at this point. Is that they could care less about national boundaries, but they play to the strong suit of different regions in terms of their mores, their values, their laws on labor, environmentalism, so forth, the politics, the baseball. They go so wherever the money is, wherever the advantage is, and they dispense with and create also the boundaries. Judge Joe Brown talked about that in one interview. He was talking about how one time he was spending time at like some good old boys club that he was privy to because of his eminence as a TV figure, and that he's just social and he's well known with some heavy hitters. And he was at some lodge skiing with them, and they said, "Oh yeah, this and that." They were in California, but I do this cool thing, or I have this in France. Hey, let's go to France. And then they take a private jet on a whim to France instantly. That's an example of the lavish lifestyle of people who own a lot, like people, you're real global. I didn't want to compromise this and make this about conspiracy by certain words that start with global, but they are people who have global interests and advantages that can as soon enjoy the benefits and bounties in different national jurisdictions no less than business interests and personal enjoyment. And a lot of the actual petty bourgeoisie, a lot of ordinary people in society, they're reared to have the values and tastes of the bourgeoisie in Western society, but they don't completely have the means or access to equitably acquiring the means. So a lot of people, they have this idea like the world is your the world is your oyster, like a global person would say, or the world is a theme park, an amusement park. I've said that maybe conscription would feel like a theme park where you're taking on this ride, you're standing in lines, you're filling out forms, you're having your medical records checked, so you could go up on a slow ascent to a roller coaster, have your picture taken before it drops you off in hell, maybe never to be seen or heard from again. But then the rest of the earth is a similar, like a theme park for a lot of people and what they aspire to. So like, oh yeah, I want to go check out Australia, and then I'm going to do this and that in Australia, and then I'm going to go to France, and then I'm going to do that, but I also want to check out Africa, because Africa sounds so cool. Like, these aren't real places that got real life going on, like it's a damn amusement park. And likely when people who think like that land somewhere, they expect people to cater to them as though they were at an amusement park, as though these were employees at the amusement park. So a lot of people, like when you're a marginalized person or a person of color, maybe in your own area, but maybe if someone's touring, they treat you like you're undesirable, unwanted, like a rat or vermin, frankly speaking. Something that is not hygienic is the way that you're treated. And or if you're at liberty, if you are at liberty to live next to someone, to have leisure time next to someone, to spend money next to someone, to actually engage someone on a footing where you have some say-so or ability to say no, walk away, you're largely appreciated as vermin, as undesirable, less than, say, only that which is necessary, if anything. If you are appreciated as being under employment somewhere where they can potentially boycott you and complain about you, then you're treated as a worker, as an amusement park. So to say the world is your oyster, no, the world is an amusement park to people who are entitled. But Naomi Klein talked a little bit about these transnational organizations, and what actually holds all this in place, the baseball locally and abroad, is more so your three-letter agencies. According to King Noble, the YouTuber, those would be your real gangsters that remain in the old sense of the word gangster, like organized crime would be your three-letter organizations. They may not understand themselves as crime. They may be appreciated or be felt as law-abiding or not law-abiding, but they essentially have the potential to operate no differently than someone who is not law-abiding, and also justify what they have and have the authorization that they have. They also subsidize some of their own goings on, where, like you would say, they say that they can exist for 5 and 6 years without government oversight, because they receive money that may be unlisted money, like dark money off the books, ostensibly because to conceal their goings on in their financial activity, which could betray their activity to foreign interests or to opposition, ostensibly. But then they refilter and use that money in sophisticated ways such that they have their own standing and holdings, and they can actually exist that way without government oversight for up to 5 years, or government finance. So should there be a finance deficit, according to one former informant, a former FBI informant who has an interview declassifying and divulging some of his activities as serving these persons, him being an African American, recruited from college campus because of his facility with socializing, but also his identity would fit neatly. And I think that man was part of participating in like a LA, like one kind of like LA like art school that was frequented and taught at by Quincy Jones, and they had different programs in the dramas and the arts. I've made other videos about how significant programs like that are in the inner city, and what outcomes they can make for people from the inner city and people who could experience people from the undercity, the best and the worst that the former would have to offer as a consequence of productive activity in that formative years. My family member he's very brilliant, hardworking, and talented, but he hasn't had some of the outcomes, and I think he had some painful experiences because he wasn't engaged in productive things during high school. So things for the arts, for the community, are very powerful and amount to real change, economic change no less, for a community. And this informant was participating in one of those in LA, staunchly, prominently, publicly, doing things like building the stage. Then he was commissioned to and carried out burning the thing down, arson, when that was what the politics state will call for, according to 3-letter agencies. So it's actually kind of Machiavellian and devious how the 3-letter organizations can operate according to whistleblowers. But he had been the one to point out that they have their own financial holdings and can operate outside of government support, and that would be declassified finance. But then also the government support itself may be black unlisted finance for purposes of national interest, ostensibly. I actually met a person like that in a gas station before. There had been like a person outside that was law enforcement, like a parking cop, and I was bantering with them because I engage a lot of people like in friendly chatter or friendly engagement to build social skills. And he pulled me aside that he thought that was interesting. Like, man, you know, she was scared as hell, you walking up to her like that, man. I never seen something like that before, man. That's kind of interesting. And then we got to talking, and he didn't declassify anything to me, but I could appreciate that there are people about us that are way savvier than we are. If they had to, they could improvise justice on the spot, and they would maybe not be known for doing so, or they would be justified and authorized for having doing so without the same oversight and sanctions, ostensibly, potentially, as your more so prominent figures would. Is appreciable that there are people like that in our midst. And according to Naomi Klein, when there had been a problem between big business in South America, as that impacted economic realities and maybe conditions of work, these 3-letter agencies went to bear, and there were a lot of people disappearing, like especially like in Chile, Argentina, stuff like that. If you've heard of Che Guevara, Che is an icon of revolution, and he's inspirational to many people with the liberational bent. He may have influenced and been a comrade and associate of Fidel Castro, who was powerful enough to have an embargo put against Cuba. Actually, I think Che Guevara and Che Guevara, they replicated and they furthered the tactics of Mao Zedong in China that were going up against. I think Mao Zedong may have went against state forces in China, and he began what became guerrilla warfare. That was taken up and furthered, I think, by Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. So Che Guevara and Fidel Castro were understood themselves as communists, but also they furthered guerrilla warfare tactics that may have been successful around Cuba, at least in other parts of South America. And then those tactics were taken up further and may have had oversight and support from them also in the area of Vietnam. I don't know exactly how China would figure into that, but I know that China and Russia are both considered communists, and there had been a Cuban Missile Crisis that was related to Cuba being communist and Russia being communist. But you could extrapolate that a lot of tactics of guerrilla warfare, the main thing that so much of our Western militarism is preoccupied with and has maybe tanked some of the national economy and debt over, is a response to guerrilla warfare that somewhat came from, as we understand, as it can be understood, from at least China with Mao Zedong, then Fidel Castro, then forces in Southeast Asia such as the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, then forces in Iraq and Afghanistan in the Middle East, and on like that. You can maybe say that some street organizations may have taken some of that because the whole world is influenced by the whole world. But that's a little bit significant to point that out. But according to Naomi Klein, these contentions over like social issues and labor and economics were heavy in South America, and so people were actually getting disappeared around that time of the like the 60s and 70s in South America. But they were perfecting torture methods on those people. So those people weren't just dying; they were going to like stadiums and they were dying heinous deaths. Some of the people in Africa, the struggle where my father comes from, South Africa, but also Namibia, they were experiencing similar horrible deaths where they would be. There's this thing called like necklacing. I won't say what necklacing is, but that type of stuff was going on in South Africa. And like my dad would tell me that like some of the people that were organized with him, when they would be abducted, when they'd be taken from their family, the police officers in South Africa and Namibia would grab the man or woman by their hair in front of their family, actually rip their hair out of their scalp how hard they were grabbing them by their hair to usher them into police cars. If a person was detained in that manner in front of their family and then never to be seen again, God can only imagine and have mercy and grace and healing for what that would have been experienced like by some of these people. My father was entertaining that type of fate. I think he met some of those type of figures, but for one, somehow he didn't experience that. Some of the people my father was fighting with was like a group called SWAPO, which is they were putting up a fight against some of this apartheid and what they appreciate as colonialism. But that SWAPO, they also have had like different factions, and I think different logistical concerns where some people of SWAPO have died, members of that had died very horrible deaths of like maybe starvation or mismanagement of human beings, where sometimes when SWAPO would detain some of their own members, I don't mean to bring up a history I'm not versed in, some of their members would actually, they would perish from the suffering of maybe poor logistics within its own organization, SWAPO. And some of the people that my father went to school with, young people who were younger than him, that he spent time around and encouraged to join the fight against apartheid and segregation in Africa. Some of them were never heard from again, either coming up against colonial forces in the forms of apartheid forces, or some of the mismanagement, infighting, and intrigue of the SWAPO organization, according to my father. And my father told me that they tried to relocate when I was a boy with me, but some of the reason that we didn't stay there, it wasn't just because there weren't jobs, but because someone had told my father that, yeah, you went to the West and you got all this education, but it's not going to do any good if you don't have your brain, and you might not have your brain if you mess around, if you play around with this stuff. So my father got the message, but they got something called brain drain in Africa, where some of the talent of African people is appreciated as migrating west, never to come back where it may be needed. So my father has, he might have ambivalence or maybe even a little bit of remorse about how he may have been appreciated as being brain drained. I had met Namibians at conferences about HIV and the HIV in 2002 in Washington D.C. and the genocide and the solidarity between the genocide in Southwest Africa in 1904 to 1908 and the Jewish Holocaust as potentially some of the original Nazis and the 1 and 2 generations parents of the actual Nazis may have been in the area of South Africa where my father's from, German Southwest Africa, perpetrating apartheid under the order of the General Van Trotha. Some of Van Trotha's descendants to this day have participated in reconciliation and solidarity with the victims of their own great descendant, and also the perpetrators of apartheid. Some of those police officers that were disappearing people and torturing people, they had an opportunity for truth and reconciliation conferences in the 90s, around the time that Nelson Mandela would have been being released, also a member of that history, and he suffered loss of freedom, which is as brutal. In isolation and confinement for many years was part of the struggle. That's also part of the struggle. Confinement is as much a part of the struggle as like a physical conflict, if not harder. As hard, if not harder, was what Nelson Mandela did, and he became the president of South Africa, partly in honor of his struggle. But these police officers, they had an opportunity to say what they did to the family and to the authorities to receive, I think they received clemency for their atrocities, but they also had a little bit of opportunity to heal both them and their family members, so the family members could know what happened and it could be stated what happened, so that the family members who were lost, they could actually be honored and they could receive their maybe their martyrdom and their valor for their sacrifice and their own loss of themselves in the struggle, the real struggle. But so that might be, so a lot of times like criminals to this day, they would think, as formidable as criminals are, they would think twice about having being known to the Jakes or 12 or 5-0 or whatnot, and you wonder what would be formidable about some donut loving 5-0 and Jake to have some criminals on their heels or on their P's and Q's. It might be because the Jake or the 5-0 or even the regular old nobody. In Western society, everybody is a police officer because everybody can inform on you, and anybody will inform on you likely if they have an opportunity to do so. It can get all the way up to the 3-letter agencies that we don't know about that have actually perfected torture. very effective and lethal killing apparatus that's in our midst. Then also some of your military commandos can effectively be like death squads, as you have not seen and cannot conceive in civil society. There are weaponry and military tactics and strategies that we are not privy to as civilians, that may have been experienced by other people, some of these people in the struggle, that would be beyond what can be imagined, that would not be anything to trifle with. That might be still at large, but those people aren't all the way necessarily wicked, but they just have interests that are part of the state that may or may not serve the welfare of the general human beings. That man I met from that type of nondescript background, he wasn't a bad person, he necessarily, as I experienced him, but he also told me that there may be more to the U.S. history than we know. He said that in the time of the revolution, you had this song "They Not Like Us" that came out recently, and it's somewhat a little bit suggested. I don't know if it was suggesting that the artist that was being referenced was not really American and therefore part of the foundational Black American experience, or because he was mulatto, he was not part of the Black American experience. But the mulatto experience is deeply part of the American experience and the Caribbean colonial experience and the African colonial experience. Being mulatto, the dynamics and effect of colorism, but also the contribution of mulattoes up to and including military, but also social. According to some of your great current proponents of foundational Black American interests, outspokenly so, such as Dr. Umar Johnson and King Noble on YouTube. A little bit lesser known, maybe King Noble, but he has some hard-hitting content going back many, like tens of years, about 10 or 15 years. I think both of them have referenced that the mulatto people have put up a big fight in the cause of foundational Black Americans. My father, a scholar of foundational Black American history, that's one of his undergrad degrees. And then on top of that, he was part of the struggle in Africa. He hasn't told me all of what his hand in it was, but I know he had something to do with an organization called SWAPO. But he has appreciated, he always had books around our house about W.E. Du Bois and like Booker T. Washington, and maybe a little bit, he took my brother to see where George Washington Carver was in Mississippi when we were in the South. But he has an appreciation for mulattoes. And according to this man that I met at the gas station, he said that he was a white man who could pass for being a white man and was part of these different organizations. But he said that he always chuckles when people talk about European this, white this, black this, light skinned this, because he said actually all of our ass is African, white, black, in between, appreciating as such, loving as such, not appreciating as such, hating as such. We're all African, according to that man. But he said that the experience of liberation in the United States, such as the revolution, when people say 1776, they may think of their white ancestors or like the Minutemen or the militias, but according to this man, the mulattoes, especially like the French, like around Louisiana, something about the mulattoes, it contributed to the intelligence that made the Revolutionary War won. Where according to this man, the Revolutionary War may not have the favor and the victory may not have fallen to the colonies as it did when it did, without the contributions of the mulatto people in that conflict. I don't know how that worked out, but according to him, is that there was something to do with the intelligence. That war was somewhat, the Revolution War, the British were formidable. They've never been nothing of pushovers in the colonialism. They could not have amounted to the different things that they did in colonialism in India, Africa, the Americas, on like that, without being very formidable and versed and seasoned in things like military tactics. The English people have been formidable. So for the colonists to overthrow the English people when they actually had been supported, it's hard to overthrow your parents. Some people would say, according to Tashreeq Bey, they maybe never in fact did overthrow the English, because a lot of what we do now is somewhat like when they say bar, the bar that the lawyers take, according to Tashreeq Bey, that stands for British Accredited Registry, and a lot of businesses and titles are still held in England, in London. And then also you would have the influence of the church behind the scenes in American society now, and then also back then, all the way up to and including the tax revenue that we have, where according to him, IRS actually stands for Inquisition Revenue Service. And so when you're paying taxes, you're actually paying fealty to Rome, no less. Still, Rome still exists in the form of the Catholic Church, according to Tashreeq Bey, and that's actually what you're paying. So when you pay tithes at church, you had already paid tithes to the crown. According to the Pope, it says pay Caesar his dues. You actually still pay your Caesar his dues each year in tax revenue, and that is the Internal Revenue Services, according to Tashreeq Bey. So the country may not have ever, in fact, won independence as we're thought, and the real people holding the titles may be similar to what they have always been, but yet the Revolutionary War, as it unfolded, and you still did have real life situations and outcomes from that, it was largely victorious and prevailed partly from the contribution of mulatto people, according to this man that I met, this nondescript man that I don't know his background, but I had an interesting conversation with him at a gas station. And I'm not trying to blast him with that, but just reference the interesting conversation. But I think I'm being discreet about his identity, because I actually don't know who the hell he was. But but colorism is very important, and so in a lot of dynamics, for better and worse, in the United States and abroad. So for songs like They Not Like Us, that might speak to some of the frustration of the entitlement and the dynamics of colorism, which is another form of racism, equally atrocious and heinous. But it can go back and forth, because a person can think they're better than another person for being of a different hue, and that person can think they're better than another person. And I think in a lot of life, we recognize that people have different strengths. You know, if you've lived a lot of life, you recognize that there's strength and beauty in all people. People that are considered black, white, mulatto, any ethnicity. You've probably seen people that are better at certain things than you, smoother at certain things than you, and you wouldn't have to go too far to look at. So a lot of us can appreciate that all of us have beauty and strength on a level. Yet some of racism is the fact that, according to King Noble, dogs don't just get mad. When you get nervous around a dog, that makes the dog nervous. So if a dog has a problem with you, you may have actually had a problem with the dog first, is what makes the dog have a problem with you. It might be similar with racism, so where it's kind of like a hot potato. So we have an attitude, or seem like we could have an attitude, that makes another person seem like they have an attitude or could have an attitude. So it's kind of like a feedback in a microphone, and it gets hellified. So there's been loss and suffering and hate on both sides of all racism, including white to black, black to white, white to mulatto, mulatto to white, black to mulatto, mulatto to white. It goes all the way around. So there are real histories and bigotry and suffering on all sides of racism. But colorism had been significant. So this family that I had spent time with were considered colored in Africa, and the colored people would have a problem with the Ovambo people. According to my experience of that family, they said derogatory things about Ovambo people there. They would say something like, I won't repeat it, but they would say a shortened version. Diminutive is when you say something shorter, but in a cute way. They would say it shorter in a heinous way about Ovambo people, some of that family, and it just showed me that there's strife within tribes. But my father had been from both of those, and that he appreciated Spanish as sounding African might be unique, according to Tashriq Bey, in that the Moorish people had an influence on Spanish, and they were also from Africa. But the last thing I just want to say is that some of the zoning and the redlining within the Twin Cities that's still kind of at writ large, that I think it may have played out in how and where both George Floyd was lost, and where Philando Castile was lost. George Floyd was slain. I think he was slain at a Target near Lake Street in Minneapolis. Lake Street itself, as it goes into St. Paul, it goes directly into becoming Marshall, and directly past the school of Philando Castile Central High School on Marshall and St. Paul. That's Lake Street in Minneapolis, very near where George Floyd was slain. That Lake Street, there's a police precinct there, and that precinct, it has a room in it that was named after a family member of mine who was she was a law enforcement person in my family, my mother's younger sister, who was she operated in, and I didn't want to say, before I don't forget, Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul was designated as a terminal point of the Underground Railroad, according to Judge Joe Brown. So there's actually a deep history of foundational Black American influence and contribution to this area where I'm at in the Twin Cities, going all the way back to slavery, according to Judge Joe Brown. The Minneapolis portion of that would be North Minneapolis, a Black community with strong history, upstanding history. Now it has a more of a street reputation, in addition to the strong reputation that might be from some of the deeper politics in baseball at play that disenfranchises African American people. but the Minneapolis component would be North Minneapolis, and then the St. Paul would be the Rondo neighborhood, actually dating back to a slavery terminal point in the Underground Railroad. Potentially is exactly what was gutted when they wanted to put a freeway through back in the day in like maybe 60s or 70s to put 94 through. And around the time of after World War II, they militarized the United States with the potential that there could be military conflict on the United States shore. That's part of what the interstate system is. It's actually a freeway infrastructure to rapidly move troops and supplies where there need to be. So was the freeway infrastructure, but you could say maybe it redoubled and was redundant as an actual civilian commercial apparatus infrastructure that would also feed into the military apparatus industrial complex, because of the viability of commerce and how that affects financing capital, maybe for better or worse. So you could say it's still military apparatus, the infrastructure of the freeway system, since it informs commerce, which informs military weaponry and finance expenditure, adventurism. It's still a function of the commerce facilitated by the interstate. All these trucks that go up and down and rush things at the speed of 80 miles an hour, a whole truck, 40,000 pounds or 80,000 pounds of commerce up down the road instantly, constantly, all day long, many of them, thousands of them, is what we have going on. But when they needed to do so, they put that freeway exactly through the Rondo neighborhood, which is an example of gentrification, but also redlining, which is that the actual zones in the Twin Cities, how sophisticated they are, but maybe arbitrary they could be in terms of what's mockingly called the streets named by the drunk Irishman in St. Paul. A more accurate thing would maybe to say that they redlined it and they zoned it to arbitrarily marginalize and benefit different communities and the different strengths and advantage that an environment would furnish. So a lot of these people, they had urban flight in back in the days, like the boom and the boom and bust of like the baby boom generation and the affluence of the 50s and 60s, and they ran to the suburbs. My actual family member, an aunt who was educated at that well-to-do St. Thomas, but had an interest in community affairs in North Minneapolis, also ran to the suburbs because she lived in the suburbs. And it's interesting that she was all about being a police officer in North Minneapolis, but she didn't live in North Minneapolis. She actually lived, so North Minneapolis is northwest of Minneapolis, which is west of St. Paul. She would go there, put her foot down around Minneapolis street criminal politics. Then she would hightail and commute east across Minneapolis, across St. Paul, across East St. Paul, across Oakdale, into Woodbury to go home cozy at night in Woodbury, as interested as she was in Minneapolis politics. So that's an example of how there's actually something to be said about policing a neighborhood that you don't reside in, and you would have some kind of interest in the politics there. That I remember my aunt, when I was a young man or a young boy, I loved basketball, so I was very interested to move to Minneapolis because they had the Timberwolves, a basketball team, and you actually do have Timberwolves wolves at large in Minnesota at night, including the Twin Cities and coyotes. For anyone that does work at night or likes to run at night, they're actually still at large. But I was keen that they had a sports team. That was really cool to me. So like when we were pulling into town, moving back, I was born in St. Paul, but I moved back here. And I was like, man, where's the stadium at? I can't wait to see the NBA. But at that time, that was around 97 when Kevin Garnett won one of the first major contracts in the NBA. I think that was like something to the tune of $125 million in 1997, which is a lot of money now and then in 1997. I don't know how much he would have got after tax. I think he actually got into there was some discrepancy and turbulence with his financial advisor, as I recall, Kevin Garnett, where he actually ended up fighting over getting some of that money back. So it can be said that didn't all work out. But I remember my aunt, who lived away from Minneapolis in Woodbury, she had a problem. She had an existential problem and was beside herself that an athlete would be awarded that much money. That was a problem for her. Now, I imagine she grew up around a lot of well-to-do people, including herself, that didn't have to work for all of what they had in life. But she had a problem with Kevin Garnett, a man of color, having money. She also had an interest in working in policing the affairs of North Minneapolis. I think that in the past, police would have been your neighborhood, your community, your brothers, sisters, uncles, fathers, friends, loved ones, lovers, children that would come to bat when there's a problem with something wasn't working. What's not working about my family? What's not working about me? That would be the police. But that you would have an interest in traveling that far across town to police something, it would speak that you would have a different interest. If you're interested in people doing well for themselves financially, you wouldn't have a problem with Kevin Garnett having a major contract like that. If you So all I'm going to say is that I think there's different incentives from things, including an economic incentive. And I've said that a lot of us, we emulate the bourgeoisie lifestyle, the landed lifestyle, being seated and served at restaurants, being served service for our vehicles, maintenance, our homes, having water running, heat running, living each day as though it were a feast, 3 large square meals a day, stuff like that. That's a lot of the lifestyle that's not actually a part of nature and maybe not sustainable outside of our consumer culture. But what necessitates that is the rat race, the 9-to-5 grind. We don't necessarily need police all the time, everywhere, all the time. But we need police to draw a paycheck all the time. So police need to be patrolling all the time. That they're patrolling somewhere that they don't belong or don't reside or don't have a stake in, for better or worse. They ride around in well-to-do militarized vehicles. You could appreciably say somewhat sightseeing. I've had crazy stuff go on in my life. Being non-affiliated, not having oversight, appreciably a civilian, I needed oversight when some crazy stuff happened. I'll just say the cavalry didn't arrive on the hill when I needed it. As much as we see police joyriding, what it feels like to me, yes, they pull over and sort stuff out sometimes, but me as a man of color, when I got into a situation that I couldn't handle as a civilian that would need higher support, police were nowhere to be found. But they are to be found when people are getting pulled over. So I think that some of the sophistication of the redlining between the Twin Cities is actually to segregate and marshal resources and the property value and the strong suit of a place. Some of these urban flight people, when they got around to recognizing the actual strength of the inner city, such as that it's located near restaurant venues, education venues, sporting venues, they had an interest in coming back, and then they came back and kicked the people out of their own neighborhoods to gentrified what remained of the neighborhoods that had already been gutted. So Rondo neighborhood was gutted. From the north, it stayed more so low income as Frogtown, but then to the south, Selby, which both Frogtown and Selby are parallel to 94 Old Rondo and are still part of Old Rondo. They gentrified Selby, so Selby is very well-to-do and upscale to some degree, but also has some of the black community there that remained and was able to survive. But the sophistication of the zoning in the cities, it might amount to the fact that traveling on Larpenteur of all places would be a perfect place to be pulled over, because you have many overlapping precincts and you have a straight road of a somewhat high speed limit in the middle of the city where people would be tempted to commute. I think that a lot of motor vehicles sustain our present reality. One is that our reality is so sprawled out, even since the time of the 50s and 60s, that a lot of things are not viable without the transportation of a vehicle. Also, I think that some of the way that they incarcerate people, a lot of it has to do with roadside stops. A lot of people of a lifestyle, marijuana, different substances are part of what it is to be a human being. Part of being in different lifestyles and even brotherhoods and sisterhoods is very tribal. If you think about it, it goes back to human history and experiences in nature. Tribal is brotherhoods, but also consuming substances is part of tribal. And so it's natural for people who are a little bit brotherhood that is tribal, even in the modern era, to be part of a brother sisterhood, to have substances. That's very normal. That's very natural. That's a perfect way to interdict and actually abduct different people of a lifestyle where, according to Tashriq Bey, you never actually had justice established upon the United States, because the people of the land, which are the people, were displaced arbitrarily, resettled arbitrarily against their advantage and interest. They were also, many treaties were compromised, overstepped, and then there were also other atrocities in the form of I don't have to go into the atrocities against the people of the land, but they're innumerable. And so therefore, you actually don't have a seating for justice. So when you have different people calling themselves officers, they're more so pirates, according to Tashriq Bey. So these different traffic venues, such as the roads, are actually they're like they're pathways similar to waterways, where you still have your vehicle is actually a ship a water course, so to speak. The word law, I think it means land, air, water, but it actually has implications of seafaring, navy apparatus, and actually you as you exist as a being are appreciated as a corporation and similar to a vessel in naval times, and that's how you're engaged in legal matters at the deeper essence of the mechanics of the lawfare, which is a form of warfare, according to Tashrik Bey, is that it's along the lines of navy apparatus. That is, the rules that would apply to the water are what apply to human conduct, bearing in undertakings and engagement in dealings. And so these different people present themselves as officers, but even who you would appreciate as trying you in a seat of justice, they put the angles in a courtroom are similar to mock what would have taken place in certain Moorish venues, seafaring venues, is what's replicated. The way that speaks to the subconscious mind and symbolism to make you feel guilty. Part of you feeling your punish must be earned. You must work for your punish. You must believe in your punishment for it to be effective. So making you appropriately appreciate yourself as being viewed guilty makes you accept yourself guilty. That is the seating of a courtroom. It's a mock and an imitation of public flogging, that is righteous indignation, that you are presented with yourself as being perceived as you accept over yourself, and that initiates your own punishment and torment, that you would believe yourself guilty by people who are already guilty of displacing people and genociding people. Then the courts can be appreciated as human trafficking venues from the standpoint of Tashrik Bey, and the law enforcement themselves can be appreciated as human traffickers, that is pirates, according to Tashrik Bey. So actually, as much as law enforcement would have a problem with human trafficking, they are actually supporting human trafficking, and us going to work against our will, receiving representative currency, which is arbitrary, and having the opportunities of life and death, food and shelter, loving romance, living healthy lives upon the earth, coerced and hoarded over by representative currency, which is also under the gun. That is the power of the state, law, military. That is actually human trafficking, that you have to get up and be somewhere that you may or may not feel like being, that may or may not serve you, and experience different things that may or may not suit you, up into and including trauma and insult in these work settings, and then being deprived of what you earn, coerced of what you earn, as extortion to landlords or bill holders, people holding titles to bill and services. That is human trafficking par excellence. So they actually necessarily don't have a problem with human trafficking. They don't have a problem. They have a problem with human trafficking that is not along their lines, that's been authoritative, that has been given by them. Another thing that the state has a problem with that I won't go into in this video is anything challenging the state's paternalism. So that you would traffic human beings, especially minors, but also human beings in general, outside of the auspices of the state, that challenges the state's sense of entitlement and authority. And I think that power is conveyed along and accepted and initiated and viable along the lines of authority. So everyone in this society that subscribes to the status quo is essentially your parent, but they're not your biological, so they're your step parent. So the next time a boss or a service member tells you something egregiously and they try to sound like your parent, say, hey, you're not my real mom, or you're not my real dad. And you'd be accurate in saying that, because they were just trying to be paternal with you, even though they don't love you or trust you like a real guardian would. They're similar to an arbitrary step parent, is what the state is. But they apply power, and their power is accepted and responded to amount to further power along the lines of paternalism. So that maybe you could say the most distasteful thing in the society would be paternalism that's not sanctioned. That's some of what maybe P. Diddy engaged with, is that he was playing with themes of paternalism and having say-so over the fate and the self-esteem of another person, like a parent would, and that is distasteful, even as landed as he would be. Jeffrey Dahmer is an example of stature, how he's a white male that's appreciated for being a white male and respected for being a white male. And if you view some of the interviews with Jeffrey Dahmer, he is respected and has standing with his interviewer, almost like a proper white male that is one with the privileges of voting, property ownership, reading, writing, so forth. The entitlement to frequent different venues and be appreciated by consumers in different venues, patrons in venues, owners in venues, as a white that is a sovereign male is what the instinct is when you look at someone like Jeffrey Dahmer. Also, he's somewhat revered and venerated, where I would say that a lot of people would have respect for, if say a person went to be incarcerated, like potentially P. Diddy, and they had something on their jacket like victimizing children. They may not survive that tour of incarceration because that's not tolerated in the society, which is actually a function of paternalism. The society is a paternal society, and one thing that distinguishes people that appreciate themselves as being adults or appreciate as being adults is they know not to cross the line of majority, that is paternalism. So anyone in the society that subscribes to the society and was raised in it would have an existential problem with someone that transgressed what's called the line of minority and majority, that is paternalism, because the society itself is a function of paternalism. As wicked and heinous as it is to do something to a minor and also an adult, as it regards minors or someone appreciated as being young, is that the paternalism was challenged. Therefore, the entire society was challenged with someone like with P. Diddy, outside of the auspices of being respected as a white male for being a white male. But Jeffrey Dahmer is more so respected and fascinating to a lot of people, even people who would have a problem with people who prey on children. Yet among Jeffrey Dahmer's victims were a child. One of his child, I think his victims was a 16-year-old male child. He may have looked similar to an adult, but I think Jeffrey Dahmer sexually victimized him. Then he escaped. The authorities returned him to him based on the confidence in the rapport that Jeffrey Dahmer would have with the law enforcement, similar to how my friend would engage police officers. His father being a police officer. If you adopt the right tone and you pass yourselves off with enough confidence and stature and standing that you would seem to be respected for as being part of the status quo or respected by the status quo, my friend could pull that off. Jeffrey Dahmer could likely pull that off. This boy was returned to Jeffrey Dahmer, where he completed and further sexually victimized him potentially, and actually confiscated his life, that has killed him, terminated his mortality prematurely. Jeffrey Dahmer he's not disgraced and ignoble, infamous the same way P. Diddy is, even though he actually victimized and actually murdered a child, a male child. Jeffrey Dahmer did so, but that actually shows some of the overlaps and ambivalence of what justice is and how it's appreciated. But I understand that the mode of power in the United States is stature, standing. That is, how appealing are you, how respected are you by the status quo. The dominant mores and social values is what's powerful in the society, and that's conveyed along and appreciated as paternalism, whether in swagger, charisma, coolness, or say-so and standing. You might have a pretense of literacy with that, or capacity, capability. I think that competence is the greatest method and mode of leadership that I would respect. But paternalism is central to the Western society. And between Jeffrey Dahmer and Pete Diddy, you have an example of some of the implications and the unfolding of stature, as Jeffrey Dahmer goes, being respected for being a white male, even though he actually victimized and murdered children, at least one child. And then Pete Diddy, as he does not have some of the same entitlement to stature based on his physical appearance and social economic standing and background, even though he's landed in terms of wealth, which some of his wealth may be appreciated by landed people as more so liquid currency rather than actual holdings and means of labor and income, or means of production, that is capital. Part of his falling out, I think he had a problem with Surat, which was like a liquor company that he had holdings in. That would be him transitioning from liquid capital, that is money, to actual holding and standing that produces money of itself, that is land in modern terms. That would be a holding in Surat. When he fell out with them, a lot of dominoes began to fall to him. You can be appreciated that he may have been victimizing or participating in the type of frolicking that he was doing, so whether that was appreciated or not by him or law enforcement or society or not. But when he fell out of favor with Surat, as it pertained to having holding, that is real capital, real standing, real title, real privilege, real holding, something to land on and build from, that became a problem. So there can be a lot learned from that. But the zoning of the cities is very significant in the Twin Cities. It may have played into how and where Philando Castile was met by an incompetent officer. Not to say that Larpenteur is necessarily worse than other parts of the city, but any cop can be as bad or as good as another cop, and he was likely pulled over there specifically because of the dynamics of that street, Larpenteur. But then he also came across an incompetent cop who, you know, everything looks like a nail to a hammer. So you practice shooting targets that may or may not be or look like minorities. You're trained to pull over people that look like minorities. You're trained to fire a firearm. You don't have a sensation of presence, of a command of what's taking place in front of you, confident enough with life and death to be competent around life and death and implementing life and death. And someone like Philando Castile loses his life in an area where it's likely that he would have been pulled over, but he also ran into a poorly trained or incompetent, maybe not well-suited cop. Then George Floyd was slain in Minneapolis, where Minneapolis cops have a reputation of having different politics than in St. Paul. Minneapolis cops are always in the news. They actually publicize some of their own shortcomings. A lot of power in warfare is passing yourself off on something because appearance is power. But in Minneapolis, you actually, to the present day, you have Minneapolis making excuses and explaining things that they hadn't necessarily been asked about, at least by the public, or they've been asked about in such a way that they're demanded to explain themselves. So I always see Minneapolis coming on, explaining themselves about different things. That might talk about some of the inside politics in baseball, where they're reputed as being corrupt and greedy. That's their reputation in Minneapolis itself, and why some of the gangsters weren't as cozy here going back. But some of the actual what Minneapolis culture, police culture is, inside baseball politics may have amounted to why and where George Floyd was slain. That inside that politics of what is Minneapolis corruption, what is Minneapolis baseball, and at the time that George Floyd was slain, but then going back generations, that might talk to some of the zoning and redlining in the Twin Cities that I appreciate as principalities, the dynamics of zoning and agreements and districts and boundaries and human conduct in dealings from ordinary civilians, children, all the way up to lawmakers. I say like children's out on their bikes. The community itself at the basic level, all the way to the lawgivers who may be a part of the community but are likely a little bit removed and therefore ambivalent and ignorant about community issues. All of those, their range of activity within the boundaries and scope of what is the rules of engagement amount to the principalities of an area referenced in the Bible, not necessarily spiritual, but yet having implications and bearing on life outcomes and opportunities, amounting to the opportunity to live and the opportunity to die untimely or timely, can amount to a spiritual outcome in terms of principalities. So the Twin Cities, even the very name of the Twin Cities, may be a case in point example, a specimen of what are municipal districts, what are principalities, what are boundaries, what are political boundaries, and how does that play out in civil society, including when civil society comes up to and against state-sanctioned authority, no less than the authority to kill, the license to kill, the highest maybe authority, as it's applied in a civilian sector, and how that would be affected by zoning and inter-district, inter-precinct politics, as the overlap and the redundancy and the heavy presence along Larpenteur, where Philando Castile was targeted and victimized, and then also how and when and where George Floyd was engaged by the type of officer that he would be. It's appreciated that Chauvin that was responsible for the outcome of George Floyd, he was appreciated as a crooked cop or a dirty cop, and any minority from the neighborhood, potentially anyone in the area, could have experienced what George Floyd did. Also, I've said in another video, I can't explain how uncanny and timely. I've done a lot of my living on Larpenteur. I've worked on Larpenteur, and around that time I had been reading books that were making my eyes strain, and I was testing my vision out by somewhat. I always enjoyed driving. I was somewhat that summer of 2016. I was actually somewhat joyriding around the Twin Cities in my own family vehicle, just to sometimes take the long way to see, can I handle the lights coming against me? Because I was testing my eyes, because I was considering going over the road at that time, which I did become a CDL as a Class B. But as I was considering Class A school, because some Uber drivers had recommended that to me at that time. So I was testing my vision at that time, and I was actually considering driving down Larpenteur that very evening. No kidding, honest to God, I was considering driving down Larpenteur that evening that Philando Castile was slain, because I was taking the long way and just testing out my eyes, and I had memories there, some of them warm, about that area. And then I went to a used bookstore to return a book of mine by Osho, a book about women that Osho had done about women. That very night, I deviated from my path, and when I was at that bookstore, someone came up to me like, "Are you okay? Are you okay? What are you doing here? Are you okay?" Because I was actually waiting them to ascertain how much that book I was returning was value. They're appraising a book I was returning at a used bookstore, a brilliant, famous bookstore called Half Price Books, where I came across the works of Arthur Avalon before that. But I was at Half Price Bookstore that night, and I had considered driving down Larpenteur, my old stopping grounds, where actually I was more so getting myself stomped by different things at that time. But I was considering driving down my old stopping ground, Larpenteur, that night that we lost Philando Castile. So that hit home a certain way for me with growing up around there, but just the fact that I had thought about driving down that road that night. So I just want to say a lot of things hit home, and a lot of things are all connected. And this is just a little bit of my testimony as someone from the Twin Cities. I don't know more or less than anyone, but I have lived around here and around Larpenteur for a long time. And there's a room in the police precinct, probably a few blocks away from where George Floyd was slain, that's named after my aunt. And I was talking about some of the dynamics about my aunt and who she was. And I could talk a little bit more about that in another video, but I hope this can be of value to someone, and I offer this respect. I want to commend this video to someone named I want to pay respect to Philando Castile and George Floyd and all men and women of color and otherwise who have lost their lives untimely to dynamics of state power and policing, or just anything in the community that doesn't, where people were going about their daily life as civilians and they lost their life in an untimely way because some of the failure of our infrastructure, whether that be traffic failures or legal incidents like this. I want to say respect to all human beings and all the different struggles I referenced in this video. My people, the overhead Edo, the Jewish Holocaust, the sufferings of South America, the rebels of South America, the rebels of Southeast Asia, Cuba, Africa, Afghanistan, even the state-sanctioned powers in that time, because we all get ourselves in different things and we don't control how the politics go, but we get up in them and we have to survive with our brothers and sisters. So for anyone who has been lost or lost themselves in human fighting and conflict, that would be appreciated as necessary or unnecessary, I say salute and solidarity, and we will meet on the other side. And I don't know that the other side is actually a place but a vibe. What I was trying to say in this video about gravity is that there's no absolute reference for time and space, east, west, or time without a reference, neither up and down, according to Arthur Avalon. So we don't necessarily fall down to the earth. I think we exist in this reality at the exact same frequency as earth, and we are what we resonate as. So as you try to get away from the earth, you come back, not necessarily, because if I were to go straight up from here and fall down from the other side of the earth, as it's appreciated being round, like if I were to dig a hole straight to China and go out the end and up the other, out of China, out of rocket, that would be, what's up to me would be down to China, and what's down to me would be up to China. So things don't necessarily fall exactly up or down for the sake of up or down. I think that we return to what we resonate as. That's why we gravitate to the earth, because we return as that. And also the earth exists on a cycle. We're not getting outside of an orbit of gravity or a cycle in this life unless we change our vibe. When we change our vibe, now we resonate different. Now we can get up out of it and through something. I think one of the best way to change your vibe is to close your eyes and sing to yourself. When you open your eyes again, you're now opening your eyes for you're now reborn in that moment, because you vibrate differently. To a degree, you now vibrate differently. That's one of the most beautiful experiences in life, is to open your eyes for the first time, having opened your eyes before. If you see someone beautiful that's on that same vibe like that, that might be something of heaven that you just saw right there. I saw a beautiful sister. I want to say shout out Sister Tish from the Living Word Church. She was a outspoken youth advocate, a dance troupe leader, and outspoken person. She had been from Chicago recently, but she was a leader in the Twin Cities around youth around the time I was in church, and we lost her early around that time, as we did my sister, Mika, who got me around involved in church. We lost both those women who impacted youth. Mika, her peers, but Sister Tish, her children and their friends in the church. But they were some of your outside. As long as we're going to be remembering anyone from the Twin Cities, we can remember Mika and Sister Tish as outstanding people. And Sister Tish is someone I laid eyes on after an altar call one time. I was walking out of a sanctuary. I had cried during the altar call. I didn't sing, but I cried, and I think that the crying, it changed my wavelength and my frequency, at least in my eyes. And I've done other videos about how profound the connection between our eyes, as they can correspond with light, and they can also correspond with the coordination and our existence, affecting conscious and subconscious levels, processes very subtly, profoundly, light does to our eyes. But should we cry tears of joy and righteousness, we're existing in a unique way at that way, and maybe opening our eyes for the first time. And I actually walked outside of a sanctuary to a green grass scene, and I saw Sister Tish after doing so one time, and that was like being reborn. And I don't think I've been the same after I saw Sister Tish in that light. So I want to say that we remember her in love, and maybe we'll return to her in love. That is a vibe. We may not go where is heaven and hell. It may be a vibe. That might be where we go in the hereafter, not to a different physical reality, but a different vibe. And you may exist anywhere in this reality called existence, potentially as a function of your vibe. You're not necessarily time and space and distance, as we appreciate that, but the vibe that you frequency, that you resonate. So I want to offer this to whatever your background, whatever you've been through, whatever corresponds or correlates with your background, or you've done or not done, or had done to you, or done for you or by you. I want to say, let's get back to the vibe of love, and then we can make a way through all this. Peace.